Tell Daddy this is how real business works. Those words spoken by a spoiled billionaire's son to an 8-year-old boy watching his father being brutally dragged off an airplane would cost a family empire $4 billion in less than 24 hours. This is the story of how a child's wisdom transformed an act of corporate cruelty into a movement that changed an entire industry forever. The soft chime of boarding announcements echoed through JFK International Airport's Terminal 4 as 8-year-old Nathan Thorne pressed his face against the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the massive Boeing 777 that would carry him and his father across the Atlantic. His breath fogged the glass as he traced the outline of the aircraft with his small finger, marveling at the engineering marvel that seemed too heavy to ever leave the ground. "Dad, how does something that big actually fly?" Nathan asked, turning to look at his father with the kind of pure curiosity that only children possess, the kind that sees magic in the mundane and refuses to accept that some things are simply impossible. Elijah Thorne looked up from his phone where he'd been reviewing the final financial reports from their 3-week acquisition trip to Tokyo and smiled at his son with the weary but genuine affection of a father who had learned to treasure these moments of wonder. At 38, Elijah carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built an empire from nothing. But when Nathan asked questions like this, he became just a dad trying to explain the world to his boy. "Well, Nathan, it's all about lift and thrust, working together against gravity and drag," Elijah said, setting down his phone and crouching to Nathan's eye level, a habit he'd developed since Charlotte's death 3 years ago when he realized that every conversation with his son was precious and deserved his full attention. The wings are shaped in a special way that makes air move faster over the top than the bottom, and that difference in speed creates the lift that pulls the plane up into the sky. Nathan nodded solemnly, processing this information with the serious expression he wore whenever learning something new, an expression that reminded Elijah so powerfully of Charlotte that it sometimes took his breath away. Nathan had inherited his mother's intellectual curiosity, along with her deep brown eyes and gentle heart traits, that made him seem older than his 8 years, while simultaneously maintaining an innocence that Elijah fought fiercely to protect. "Mom always said that when things seem impossible, there's usually a scientific explanation that makes it make sense," Nathan said quietly, unconsciously, touching the small silver locket he wore around his neck, the one that contained Charlotte's last letter to him, which he was supposed to read when he turned 18, but carried everywhere because it made him feel close to her. Elijah's chest tightened at the mention of Charlotte, not with the sharp pain that had characterized the first 2 years after her death, but with the bittersweet ache of love that endures beyond loss. Charlotte Thorne had been a quantum physicist at MIT, a woman who could explain the mysteries of the universe with the same patience she used to teach Nathan his multiplication tables, and her sudden death from a brain aneurysm had left both father and son struggling to make sense of a world that no longer included her brilliant light. "Your mother was right about most things," Elijah said softly, standing and placing his hand on Nathan's shoulder, feeling the small, strong bones beneath his son's red sweater, a sweater Charlotte had knitted the winter before she died. She used to say that understanding how something works doesn't make it less magical. It just gives you a deeper appreciation for the complexity and beauty of creation. Nathan looked up at his father, studying his face with the perceptive gaze that sometimes unnerved adults who weren't prepared for a child to see through their carefully constructed facades. "Are you thinking about her again, Dad? You get that look when you're missing her." Elijah felt his throat constrict with emotion, amazed as always by his son's emotional intelligence and ability to read the subtle changes in mood that most people missed entirely. This trip to Tokyo had been Nathan's first international business trip, a decision Elijah had made because Charlotte had always insisted that education came from experience as much as textbooks, and she would have wanted Nathan to see the world beyond their Manhattan penthouse. "I think about her every day, son, especially when I see how much you're like her," Elijah admitted pulling Nathan into a brief hug that smelled of airport coffee and the expensive cologne that was one of his few remaining vanities. But those thoughts make me happy now instead of just sad because I see her living on in you, in the way you question everything and care about people and try to understand how the world works. Nathan hugged him back fiercely with the desperate intensity of a child who had learned too early that the people you love can disappear without warning, leaving behind only memories and the challenge of carrying their values forward into an uncertain future. I wish she was here to see the plane with us. She would have loved explaining all the physics of how the engines work and why the wings don't fall off. She is here, Nathan Elijah said, meaning it more than his rational mind wanted to accept, because there were too many moments when he could swear he felt Charlotte's presence, guiding his decisions, and whispering her wisdom through their son's innocent observations. Every time you ask questions or show kindness to someone or refuse to accept that something can't be done, she's right here with us. Elijah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his assistant Sarah Jenkins back in New York, reminding him that the AeroVantage Airlines merger documents were waiting for his digital signature on the secure server, a signature that would either save the struggling airline or condemn it to bankruptcy, depending on his assessment of their corporate culture and leadership potential. Titanium Ledger. Holdings had built its reputation on acquiring distressed assets and either transforming them into profitable enterprises or dismantling them for parts, a process that had made Elijah wealthy beyond imagination, but had also earned him the nickname the Reaper among Wall Street circles. Is that about the airplane company we're helping? Nathan asked, noticing his father's phone. During the Tokyo trip, Elijah had tried to explain his work in terms an 8-year-old could understand, describing acquisitions as helping companies that are in trouble, though he had left out the more ruthless aspects of private equity that involved massive layoffs and asset stripping when companies couldn't be saved. Yes, the airline executives are waiting for my decision about whether we can help them become better at what they do, Elijah said, choosing his words carefully because Nathan had developed an uncanny ability to detect when adults were being less than truthful, a skill Charlotte had encouraged, because she believed children deserved honest answers to their questions even when the truth was complicated. Nathan frowned slightly, the expression he wore when processing complex information. Mom always said that helping should make people happy, not scared. Will the people who work for the airplane company be happy if we help them? The question hit Elijah like a physical blow because it cut straight to the moral center of his business practices in a way that his Harvard MBA and decades of financial analysis never had. Charlotte had possessed the same ability to reduce complex ethical questions to their essential components, to strip away the justifications and euphemisms and examine the raw human impact of corporate decisions. That's the goal, Nathan Elijah said, slowly realizing as he spoke that his son's question would influence his decision about AeroVantage more than any financial metric or market analysis possibly could. Your mother used to say that real success isn't just about making money, it's about making the world a little bit better for the people whose lives you touch. Nathan nodded seriously, then pressed his face back against the window as their boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Priority boarding for first-class passengers and families traveling with small children on AeroVantage Flight 882 to London Heathrow. That's us, Elijah said, shouldering his leather duffel bag, a custom Hermes piece that looked understated despite costing more than most people's annual salary. He wore his wealth quietly, preferring the charcoal cashmere hoodie and premium joggers that made him look like a tech entrepreneur or graduate student rather than one of the most powerful investors in Manhattan. Nathan grabbed his small backpack, which contained his tablet, a worn copy of A Wrinkle in Time that had been Charlotte's favorite childhood book, and a collection of origami paper that he used to create small sculptures when he was nervous or thinking through problems. Dad, do you think the people on the plane will be nice to us? The question seemed innocent enough, but Elijah caught the underlying concern in Nathan's voice, The awareness that not everyone treated them with kindness when they didn't immediately recognize his wealth and influence. Nathan had learned through experience that wearing casual clothes in expensive places sometimes resulted in different treatment, though. Elijah had tried to shield him from the worst examples of casual racism and class discrimination. Most people are good. Nathan, even when they don't show it right away. Elijah said, taking his son's hand as they walked toward the gate, repeating the words Charlotte had always used when explaining human nature's complexities. Sometimes people make assumptions based on what they see instead of taking time to understand who someone really is, but that says more about them than it does about us. Nathan squeezed his father's hand, a gesture of trust and connection that reminded Elijah why every decision he made now had to pass the test of whether it would make his son proud, whether it honored Charlotte's memory and the values she had instilled in both of them. As they approached the gate, Agent Nathan looked up at him with Charlotte's eyes and said, "Whatever happens on the plane, we'll handle it together right, Dad." "Always, son," Elijah replied, having no idea that in the next few hours his 8-year-old boy would demonstrate wisdom that would reshape an entire industry and teach a room full of adults what it really means to choose healing over hatred. The gate area for Flight 882 buzzed with the controlled chaos typical of international departures, business travelers checking phones while juggling coffee cups and laptops, families corralling excited children and oversized carry-on bags. All of them united by the shared anticipation of crossing an ocean in a metal tube that would somehow deliver them safely to another continent. The AeroVantage gate agent, a woman named Beatrice Morrison who had worked for the airline for 15 years and took pride in maintaining order. During the boarding process, stood behind her counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of passengers without ever really seeing them as individuals. When Elijah and Nathan approached the priority boarding line, Beatrice's eyes immediately cataloged the details that didn't match her expectations for first-class passengers. She saw the expensive hoodie that looked like casual streetwear to her untrained eye, the worn sneakers that suggested budget consciousness rather than luxury indifference, and most significantly, a black man and his son in a space typically occupied by older white executives in business suits who carried themselves with the unmistakable arrogance of inherited privilege. "Sir Economy and Premium Economy Board. In about 20 minutes, Beatrice said, without looking at their boarding passes, her tone carrying the automatic authority of someone who spent her days directing passenger traffic and had developed a mental shorthand for categorizing people based on appearance rather than documentation. "This line is for first class and business travelers only." Nathan looked up at his father with confusion, having been taught since he could walk that you should always show proper identification when requested, rather than assume people would know who you are or where you belong. In his 8-year-old logic, the solution was simple: show the nice lady the boarding passes and clear up the obvious misunderstanding that had somehow occurred. "Dad, should we show her our tickets?" Nathan asked in his clear, innocent voice that carried just far enough for other passengers in the priority line to overhear his question, highlighting the assumption that had been made about their travel class based entirely on their appearance, rather than any actual evidence of their seat assignments. Elijah felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied these moments when his son witnessed discrimination firsthand, moments that forced him to decide whether to use his influence to make the problem disappear quickly or to turn the experience into a teaching opportunity about dignity and grace under pressure. Charlotte had always advocated for the latter approach, believing that Nathan needed to understand how prejudice operated in the real world, while also learning how to respond with strength rather than bitterness. "We can show her our boarding passes, if that would help clarify things," Elijah said calmly, pulling out his phone to display their seat assignments while maintaining eye contact with Beatrice, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate these situations without escalating conflict unnecessarily. "We're in seats 1A and 1B. Beatrice glanced at the screen reluctantly, clearly expecting to find economy seats that would confirm her initial assessment and justify her directive to move to the back of the line. When she saw the first-class seat assignments and recognized the name Thorne from the VIP passenger list she had reviewed that morning, her expression shifted from confident authority to confused uncertainty, as if the computer system had somehow malfunctioned and assigned premium seats to people who obviously didn't belong in that cabin. "There must be some kind of error in the system," Beatrice muttered more to herself than to Elijah and Nathan, her tone suggesting that the problem lay with the technology rather than her assumptions about who deserved first-class treatment. She scanned the QR code with her handheld device, waiting for the angry red beep that would confirm the mistake and allow her to redirect these passengers to their proper place in the aircraft hierarchy. Instead, the scanner chirped green and displayed the confirmed seat assignments, along with a note that Mr. Thorne was listed as a VIP passenger requiring special attention due to his relationship with the airline's pending merger negotiations. Beatrice stared at the screen for several seconds, processing information that contradicted everything her unconscious bias had told her about these particular travelers. Nathan watched the interaction with the intense focus he brought to anything that didn't make logical sense, his young mind working to understand why showing identification had been necessary when other passengers in line hadn't been asked to prove their seat assignments. He had inherited Charlotte's analytical nature, along with her unwillingness to accept surface explanations for complex social phenomena. "Ma'am, why did we need to show our tickets when the people in front of us didn't?" Nathan asked with genuine curiosity. His question delivered without accusation, but with the kind of innocent directness that often revealed uncomfortable truths about adult behavior and the unexamined assumptions that guided daily interactions. Beatrice flushed slightly, realizing that her differential treatment had been noticed not just by the passengers involved, but by others in line who were now paying attention to how she handled the situation. She had been trained in customer service protocols that emphasized treating all passengers with equal respect, but those protocols often collided with unconscious biases that influenced her split-second judgments about who belonged where. "Just standard procedure for international flights?" Beatrice said weakly, knowing that her explanation didn't address the obvious disparity in how she had treated different passengers, but hoping that the boarding process could continue without further examination of her decision-making patterns. "You can proceed to the aircraft seats 1A and 1B left turn after the jet bridge." Elijah placed his hand gently on Nathan's shoulder, steering him toward the boarding tunnel while using the moment as a teaching opportunity about grace and forgiveness, even when facing unfair treatment. Charlotte had always insisted that how you respond to prejudice reveals more about your character than the prejudice itself reveals about the person expressing it. "Thank you for your help," Elijah said to Beatrice, his tone genuinely courteous despite the obvious slight they had experienced modeling for Nathan, the kind of dignified response that maintains personal integrity while refusing to match negativity with negativity. As they walked down the jet bridge, Nathan processed the interaction with the serious expression he wore when trying to understand adult behavior that seemed inconsistent with the values he had been taught. "Dad, was that lady being mean to us because of how we look?" Elijah paused in the jet bridge, kneeling to Nathan's eye level, so they could have this conversation with the privacy and attention it deserved. The jet bridge smelled of recycled air and jet fuel, and through the small windows they could see ground crews preparing the aircraft for departure. Ordinary people doing their jobs with the same professionalism, regardless of who was watching. Sometimes people make quick judgments based on what they see instead of taking time to understand who someone really is, Elijah said carefully, using Charlotte's words to explain a complex social dynamic without burdening Nathan with more cynicism than necessary for his protection and education. "That lady probably sees a lot of passengers every day, and she might have developed some automatic assumptions that aren't always accurate. Nathan considered this explanation with the thoughtfulness that characterized his approach to learning about the world. "But you taught me not to judge books by their covers. Mom always said that the most interesting stories are often hidden behind ordinary-looking covers." The wisdom in his son's observation struck Elijah with the force of Charlotte's presence, reminding him that 8-year-old Nathan often possessed insights that eluded adults who had become comfortable with convenient prejudices and social shortcuts. Charlotte had cultivated Nathan's ability to see beyond surface appearances, to look for the humanity in everyone he encountered. "Your mother was right." "As usual," Elijah said, standing and taking Nathan's hand as they continued toward the aircraft. "The important thing is that we don't let other people's assumptions change how we treat them or how we see ourselves. We know who we are, and we know what your mother taught us about dignity and kindness." Nathan nodded solemnly, then brightened as they approached the aircraft door. "Dad, I'm excited about flying in first class together. Mom always said that adventures are more fun when you share them with people you love." Elijah felt his heart constrict with love and grief and pride, amazed once again by his son's ability to find joy and meaning in experiences despite the complications that adults created through their prejudices and assumptions. As they stepped onto the Boeing 777, Elijah had no idea that the next few hours would test everything Charlotte had taught them about responding to hatred with healing. The first-class cabin of AeroVantage Flight 882 represented the pinnacle of commercial aviation luxury, with its cream leather seats that converted to fully flat beds, personal entertainment systems with 21-inch screens, and mood lighting designed to create an atmosphere of exclusive comfort that justified the premium pricing. Each suite offered privacy and space that transformed the flying experience from endurance test to sanctuary, at least for those fortunate enough to afford such accommodations. Elijah and Nathan settled into seats 1A and 1B, the coveted front row that offered maximum legroom and minimal disturbance from other passengers. Nathan immediately began exploring the seat controls with the fascination of a child encountering advanced technology, adjusting the lighting and testing the recline function, while Elijah stowed their carry-on bags and prepared his laptop to review the AeroVantage merger documents during the 7-hour flight to London. "Dad, this seat has more buttons than your car," Nathan observed with delight, discovering the massage function and the individual air conditioning controls that allowed passengers to customize their environment to precise specifications. Mom would have loved figuring out how all this engineering works together to make people comfortable. Elijah smiled at his son's enthusiasm while opening the financial reports that would determine AeroVantage's future documents that revealed a company bleeding cash, despite maintaining the facade of luxury and exclusivity that attracted passengers willing to pay premium prices for superior service. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was literally sitting in the first-class cabin of an airline, whose fate rested in his hands, making decisions that would affect thousands of employees based on leadership competence and corporate culture. Flight attendant Jessica Martinez approached their seats with the professional warmth that characterized excellent customer service, her smile genuine as she offered pre-departure beverages and answered Nathan's questions about the aircraft specifications with patience and detailed knowledge that impressed both father and son. Jessica had been with AeroVantage for 12 years and took pride in making every passenger feel valued, regardless of their age or background. "Would you gentlemen care for champagne or perhaps juice for the young man?" Jessica asked, her tone suggesting that Nathan's presence in first class was perfectly natural and welcome, a response that immediately earned Elijah's respect and reminded him that individual employees often embodied values that didn't always reflect their company's overall culture. "Orange juice would be perfect." "Thank you, Nathan," replied politely, using the manners Charlotte had drilled into him about treating service workers with respect and appreciation. "And could you tell me how long it takes to fly across the ocean? I'm trying to understand how the pilots navigate when they can't see any landmarks." Jessica's face lit up at Nathan's question, and she spent several minutes explaining GPS technology and international flight corridors, while Elijah continued reviewing the merger documents that painted an increasingly troubling picture of corporate mismanagement and declining service standards, despite the evident quality of frontline employees like Jessica. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered by loud, entitled voices from the galley area, where someone was clearly expressing dissatisfaction with their seat assignment in terms that suggested they were accustomed to having their demands met through force of personality rather than reasonable negotiation. Elijah looked up from his laptop, immediately alert to potential threats to Nathan's comfort and safety. "This is absolutely ridiculous," declared Connor Blackwood, the 28-year-old son of AeroVantage CEO Harrison Blackwood, his voice carrying the petulant anger of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted and couldn't comprehend why airline employees weren't immediately accommodating his preferences. "My assistant specifically requested seat 1A this morning, and I find some random passengers sitting in my spot like they own the place." Connor stood in the galley wearing an expensive suit that couldn't disguise his soft features and weak chin, his artificially whitened teeth bared in the kind of aggressive smile that wealthy men used when they expected their status to overcome any obstacle. He had inherited his father's sense of entitlement without developing any of the business acumen that might have justified such confidence, spending his trust fund on luxury cars and exclusive nightclubs while contributing nothing meaningful to the family airline empire. Chief Purser Monica Wells, a veteran flight attendant with 25 years of experience, managing difficult passengers, stood beside Connor with the practiced patience of someone who had dealt with countless entitled travelers who believed their money granted them unlimited authority over airline operations. Monica had developed a keen eye for identifying passengers who could be safely pressured into giving up their seats versus those who would create more problems if confronted. Mr. Blackwood. The manifest clearly shows seats 1A and 1B are occupied by confirmed passengers with valid tickets. Monica explained in her most diplomatic voice, hoping to resolve the situation without escalating conflict or disturbing other first-class passengers who had paid premium prices for a peaceful travel experience. "We have you assigned to seat 2B, which offers identical amenities and service." Connor's face flushed red with indignation at the suggestion that any seat other than 1A could possibly meet his requirements, his sense of entitlement so deeply ingrained that he literally couldn't conceive of accepting an alternative arrangement. "I don't want identical amenities. I want that specific seat because it has the best view and the most privacy, and frankly, those people don't look like they belong in first class anyway." Nathan looked up from his orange juice, his 8-year-old mind processing the ugly implications of Connor's statement with the clarity that children often bring to adult prejudices. He had been raised to believe that airplane seats were assigned based on tickets and payment, rather than appearance or assumptions about who deserved luxury accommodations. "Dad, why does that man think he should have our seats?" Nathan asked in his clear, innocent voice that carried throughout the first-class cabin, his question highlighting the fundamental irrationality of Connor's demands while demonstrating the kind of logical thinking that often embarrassed adults who were behaving unreasonably. Elijah felt his protective instincts surge as he recognized the dangerous combination of entitlement and prejudice in Connor's behavior, but he also saw an opportunity to teach Nathan about dignity under pressure, while potentially diffusing the situation through calm reasoning rather than confrontation. Charlotte had always insisted that the best way to handle bullies was to maintain your principles while refusing to sink to their level of behavior. "Some people think they're more important than others, Nathan, but your mother taught us that every person deserves the same respect regardless of how much money they have or who their father might be," Elijah said clearly enough for Connor and Monica to overhear his words, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned to navigate power dynamics without compromising his values. Connor's eyes narrowed as he processed this implicit challenge to his authority, his brain struggling to reconcile the calm confidence in Elijah's voice with his assumption that these passengers could be easily intimidated into surrendering their seats. He had grown up in a world where his last name opened doors and solved problems where service workers deferred to his wishes without question. "Listen, buddy," Connor said, stepping closer to seat one. With the aggressive posture of someone preparing to use intimidation as negotiation tactic. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is my father's airline, and when I want a particular seat, I get that seat. So, why don't you grab your kid and move back to economy where you probably belong anyway?" The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud, its impact magnified by Nathan's presence, and the casual cruelty of suggesting that an 8-year-old boy didn't deserve to sit beside his father in seats they had legitimately purchased. Monica Wells felt her stomach drop as she realized the situation was escalating beyond her ability to manage through diplomatic intervention. Nathan looked at Connor with the unflinching gaze he had inherited from Charlotte, a look that seemed to see straight through to the insecurity and emptiness that drove such ugly behavior. "Why do you need my dad's seat when yours looks exactly the same? They're both in the front of the airplane with the same buttons and the same view." The question, delivered with 8-year-old logic and innocence, cut through Connor's bluster and exposed the arbitrary nature of his demands, while highlighting the absurdity of adult behavior that prioritized symbolic victories over rational problem-solving. Connor's face darkened as he realized a child had just publicly questioned his reasoning and found it lacking. "Because I want it, kid, and what I want, I get." Connor snapped, his voice rising loud enough to attract attention from other passengers who were beginning to sense the brewing conflict. "Maybe your father should teach you some respect for people who are actually important instead of letting you mouth off to your betters." Elijah felt ice-cold anger surge through his veins as Connor's words hit his son, but Charlotte's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that responding to cruelty with cruelty only perpetuated cycles of harm that ultimately damaged everyone involved. Nathan needed to see how strong people handled bullies without becoming bullies themselves. "Nathan, remember what your mother always said about people who need to hurt others to feel important," Elijah said softly, standing to place himself between his son and Connor, while maintaining the calm dignity that had characterized his approach to every challenge since Charlotte's death. "They're usually the smallest people in the room, no matter how loud they get." Connor's face turned purple with rage at being dismissed by someone he had already categorized as inferior, his fragile ego unable to tolerate the suggestion that his behavior reflected weakness rather than strength. He had never been challenged so directly by anyone outside his immediate family, and the experience of having his authority questioned by a child and ignored by the child's father triggered a tantrum of epic proportions. "You have no idea who you're messing with, Connor," snarled his voice, carrying throughout the first-class cabin and drawing shocked stares from other passengers who couldn't believe they were witnessing such a display of entitled rage. "When my father finds out how his passengers are being treated on his own aircraft, heads are going to roll, starting with yours." Monica Wells realized that the situation had moved beyond her authority to resolve, and that she needed to involve the captain before Connor's behavior became even more disruptive to other passengers. As she reached for the interphone to call the cockpit, she had no idea that she was about to trigger a chain of events that would destroy the airline empire Connor was threatening to unleash against a family whose only crime was sitting in seats they had rightfully purchased. Captain Richard Calloway emerged from the cockpit with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority within the confines of his aircraft. His silver hair perfectly groomed and his uniform immaculate, despite having spent the last hour completing pre-flight preparations for the transatlantic journey. At 55, Calloway had been flying commercial aircraft for 3 decades and had developed the kind of professional arrogance that came from never having his decisions questioned by passengers or crew members who understood the hierarchy that governed aviation operations. He surveyed the first-class cabin with the calculating gaze of someone assessing a problem that needed to be solved quickly and efficiently. His eyes taking in Connor's flushed face and agitated posture, Monica's obvious discomfort with the escalating situation and the calm dignity radiating from Elijah and Nathan, despite being the targets of increasingly hostile behavior. "What seems to be the problem here, folks?" Captain Calloway asked in the patronizing tone he reserved for passenger disputes, his voice carrying the assumption that whatever conflict had emerged could be resolved through his superior judgment and unquestionable authority within the aircraft's confines. Connor immediately launched into an indignant explanation that painted himself as the victim of unreasonable passengers who were refusing to accommodate his perfectly reasonable request for Seat 1. His version of events carefully edited to exclude his increasingly racist and classist commentary while emphasizing his status as the son of the airline's chief executive officer. "Captain, these people are refusing to move to economy where they belong, so I can sit in the seat. My assistant specifically requested this morning," Connor said, with the confident expectation that identifying his family connection would immediately resolve the situation in his favor. "I've been flying first class on this airline since I was a child, and I've never encountered such stubborn passengers who don't understand basic courtesy and respect for regular customers." Nathan looked up at Captain Calloway with the same innocent curiosity he had shown earlier, his young mind trying to understand why the airplane's captain would be involved in a dispute about seats that had already been assigned, according to whatever system airlines use to manage passenger accommodations. "Sir, are you going to make us move from our seats?" Nathan asked with the directness that children bring to adult situations. They don't fully understand his question, highlighting the fundamental absurdity of removing paying passengers to accommodate someone else's preferences, rather than flight safety or operational requirements. Captain Calloway looked down at Nathan with the indulgent expression adults often wore when addressing children they considered charming but ultimately irrelevant to serious adult business, not recognizing that this particular 8-year-old possessed wisdom that would soon expose the moral bankruptcy of the decision he was contemplating. "Well, son, sometimes grown-ups need to make compromises to keep everyone happy," Captain Calloway said condescendingly, his tone suggesting that Nathan couldn't possibly understand the complex social dynamics that required some passengers to defer to others based on unstated but clearly understood hierarchies of importance and influence. Elijah felt his jaw tighten at the captain's dismissive tone toward Nathan, but he maintained his composure while pulling out his phone to record the interaction, a precaution Charlotte had taught him to take whenever facing potential discrimination or abuse of authority. The phone's camera captured Captain Calloway's face as he processed the implications of being recorded during what he had assumed would be a simple resolution of passenger seating disputes. "Captain, I want to make sure I understand your position correctly," Elijah said calmly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had learned to navigate corporate power structures through preparation and documentation rather than emotional confrontation. "Are you asking paying passengers to give up their assigned seats to accommodate another passenger's preferences? And if so, what compensation is the airline offering for this involuntary change in our travel arrangements?" The question caught Captain Calloway off guard because it demonstrated legal knowledge that suggested these weren't typical passengers who could be easily intimidated through appeals to his authority, but rather individuals who understood their rights and were prepared to document any violations of standard airline policies and federal aviation regulations. "Sir, I am the captain of this aircraft, and I have the authority to reassign seats for operational safety and passenger comfort," Captain Calloway said with growing irritation, falling back on the bureaucratic language that airline employees use to justify decisions that might not withstand scrutiny if examined by regulators or civil rights attorneys. Connor Blackwood smirked with satisfaction as he watched the captain assert his authority, confident that his family connection had triggered the kind of preferential treatment he had received throughout his privileged life treatment that reinforced his belief that rules existed to serve people like him rather than to protect everyone equally. "That's right," Captain Connor said with vindictive pleasure. "These people need to learn some respect for their betters and stop acting like they own the place just because they managed to buy first-class tickets somehow. Nathan's eyes widened at the ugly implications of Connor's statement, his 8-year-old sense of fairness offended by the suggestion that some people were inherently better than others regardless of their behavior or character. Charlotte had raised him to believe in human dignity and equality values that were being directly challenged by the adults surrounding him. "Dad, what does he mean by they're betters?" Nathan asked loudly enough for other passengers to hear his innocent question, exposing the racist and classist assumptions underlying Connor's demands, while demonstrating the kind of moral clarity that often shames adults into reconsidering their behavior. Before Elijah could respond, actress Sophia Rivers in seat 2A pulled out her phone and began recording the interaction, her celebrity instincts recognizing a moment of social injustice that needed to be documented and shared with her 52 million social media followers. Sophia had built her career on authentic portrayals of strong women who fought against oppression, and she couldn't remain silent when witnessing real-world discrimination. Captain Calloway noticed the recording devices and felt a flicker of uncertainty about the wisdom of forcibly removing passengers who clearly understood their rights and had the technology to document any abuse of authority. But Connor's family connection and implied threats about employment consequences overrode his better judgment. "I'm going to ask you one more time to gather your belongings and move to alternative seating," Captain Calloway said to Elijah with barely concealed hostility, his tone carrying the implicit threat of force while avoiding language that could be construed as explicitly discriminatory if the recording became public. Elijah looked at his 8-year-old son, who was watching the adult interaction with the kind of intense focus that suggested he understood far more about the situation than anyone realized, and made a decision that honored Charlotte's memory and her teachings about standing up for principle even when facing overwhelming opposition. "Captain, my son and I will remain in our assigned seats, for which we have paid full fare, unless you can provide a legitimate safety reason for moving us that applies equally to all passengers regardless of their family connections or assumptions about their worthiness. To fly first class," Elijah said with quiet dignity, his words carrying the moral authority of someone who had learned to choose integrity over convenience. The refusal to comply triggered Captain Calloway's authoritarian instincts, and he reached for the interphone to summon Port Authority police officers, believing that the threat of arrest would force compliance from passengers he had already dismissed as troublemakers who needed to learn respect for authority through harsh consequences. Nathan watched his father's calm strength in the face of escalating threats, and understood that he was witnessing a defining moment that would teach him about courage, dignity, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when powerful people try to make you back down. As the captain made the call that would transform a seating dispute into a viral moment of injustice, Nathan had no idea that his 8-year-old wisdom would soon guide adults toward healing rather than hatred. The holding area at the Port Authority police station smelled of industrial disinfectant and despair, its fluorescent lights, casting harsh shadows on concrete walls, painted institutional green sometime in the 1980s and never updated since. Elijah sat on the metal bench with his arm around Nathan, both of them still processing the shocking violence they had experienced simply for refusing to surrender their airline seats to accommodate a spoiled billionaire son. Nathan leaned against his father's side, his small body trembling slightly from the adrenaline and confusion of watching armed officers drag his father down an airplane aisle while passengers recorded the brutality on their phones. The 8-year-old's world had been fundamentally altered in the span of 30 minutes, his innocent faith in adult fairness and justice challenged by the raw display of power and prejudice he had witnessed. "Dad, why did they hurt you when we didn't do anything wrong?" Nathan asked in a small voice that broke Elijah's heart, his son's question cutting straight to the moral center of their situation, with the kind of clarity that adults often lost when navigating complex social and legal systems designed to protect privilege rather than principle. Elijah felt the dull ache in his shoulder where the handcuffs had been wrenched behind his back, the physical pain a minor consideration compared to the emotional trauma of having his son witness such ugly treatment simply because they had refused to accept discrimination disguised as customer service. The scratches on his wrist were already forming scabs, permanent reminders of what happened when dignity collided with entitlement. Sometimes Nathan people with power use that power to hurt others instead of helping them, especially when they're afraid or angry or trying to protect something they think belongs to them, Elijah said carefully, drawing on Charlotte's wisdom about explaining difficult concepts without destroying a child's fundamental faith in human goodness and the possibility of justice. Nathan processed this explanation with the serious expression he wore when learning about subjects that challenged his understanding of how the world was supposed to work, according to the values Charlotte and Elijah had instilled in him through years of patient teaching and moral example. But Mom always said that when people hurt you, you can choose to hurt back or heal forward. Nathan said quietly, unconsciously touching the silver locket around his neck that contained Charlotte's final letter, the one he wasn't supposed to read until his 18th birthday, but carried everywhere because it made him feel connected to her love and wisdom. The simple statement hit Elijah like a physical blow because it captured the essential choice he faced in responding to their treatment. He could use his wealth and influence to destroy Connor Blackwood and AeroVantage Airlines through legal warfare and financial manipulation. Or he could find a way to transform this moment of injustice into an opportunity for education and growth that honored Charlotte's memory and her belief in redemption over revenge. "Your mother was the wisest person I ever knew, son," Elijah said with a thickness in his throat that threatened to become tears, amazed once again by Nathan's ability to channel Charlotte's moral clarity in moments when adults were tempted to abandon their principles in favor of immediate satisfaction and retribution. Nathan looked up at his father with eyes that seemed far older than 8 years, eyes that had seen too much ugliness already but still maintained the spark of hope and compassion that Charlotte had nurtured through bedtime stories about heroes who chose difficult paths because they were right rather than easy. "Dad, can I call Grandpa Judge?" Nathan asked, referring to Judge Richardson, Elijah's mentor, and Charlotte's father, who had guided both of them through the legal and ethical complexities of building wealth while maintaining integrity in a world that often rewarded compromise over principle. Before Elijah could respond, his phone buzzed with notifications that had been accumulating while they were processed through the arrest and booking procedure messages and missed calls that suggested the outside world was already reacting to whatever documentation had emerged from their confrontation on Flight 882. The viral video from Sophia Rivers had exploded across social media platforms with the kind of velocity that characterized moments of genuine injustice that touched universal nerves about fairness, dignity, and the abuse of power by those who believed their wealth and connections placed them above accountability for their actions. Within 2 hours of being uploaded, the footage had accumulated over 5 million views and generated hundreds of thousands of comments from viewers who recognized the fundamental wrongness of what they were witnessing: a well-dressed child watching his father being brutalized by uniformed officers for the crime of sitting in airplane seats they had legitimately purchased. The hashtag #SeatJustice was trending globally as users shared their own stories of discrimination in transportation, hospitality, and other service industries, where assumptions about worthiness often determined treatment, regardless of actual policies or legal rights. The Internet had done what the Internet did best, transformed an individual injustice into a collective moment of reckoning. Nathan watched his father read through the messages with growing amazement, not understanding the full implications of viral social media, but recognizing that something significant was happening beyond the walls of their holding cell based on Elijah's changing expression as he processed the scope of public response. "Dad, are people talking about what happened to us?" Nathan asked with the intuitive understanding that children often possess about adult emotions and social dynamics, even when they lack the experience to fully comprehend the mechanisms involved. "Yes, Nathan. It looks like a lot of people saw what happened, and they're upset about how we were treated," Elijah said slowly, realizing that their private moment of discrimination had become a public symbol of larger issues about race, class, and corporate accountability in ways that would inevitably affect how he chose to respond. Nathan nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that would ultimately determine whether this moment became about destruction or transformation. "Dad, do you think we can use what happened to help other families so they don't have to go through what we went through?" The question embodied everything Charlotte had taught them about finding purpose in pain and using personal experiences of injustice to create positive change, rather than simply seeking revenge against those who had caused harm. It was the question that would guide Elijah's decisions in the coming hours and days as he chose between two fundamentally different paths forward. "I think your mother would want us to try," Elijah said, pulling Nathan closer and feeling Charlotte's presence in their small, cramped cell as strongly as if she were sitting beside them, offering her wisdom about choosing the difficult path of healing over the easy path of hatred. 45 floors above the foggy streets of London, Harrison Blackwood stood at the windows of his corner office in the Shard, watching the city wake up beneath him while his business empire collapsed in real time on the screens that covered every wall of the executive boardroom. At 62, Harrison had spent 30 years building AeroVantage Airlines from a regional carrier into a global aviation powerhouse, but he had never imagined that his legacy would be destroyed by his son's tantrum over an airplane seat. The mahogany conference table was littered with tablets and phones displaying the cascading disaster that had begun with Sophia Rivers's viral video and was now spreading through financial markets like a contagion that threatened everything Harrison had worked to build. Stock prices were plummeting faster than his panicked communications team could issue damage control statements, and the merger with Titanium Ledger Holdings that represented their only path to financial survival was evaporating before his eyes. Chief Financial Officer Margaret Sinclair sat at the table with her head in her hands, surrounded by spreadsheets and financial projections that had become obsolete the moment Connor decided he was more important than paying customers who happened to be sitting in a seat he wanted. The numbers told a brutal story. Without Elijah Thorne's investment, AeroVantage would be bankrupt within 72 hours. "Sir, we need to get ahead of this somehow," Margaret said, without looking up from her laptop screen, which displayed real-time social media analytics showing #SeatJustice spreading across platforms with the kind of exponential growth that destroyed corporate reputations overnight. "The video has 15 million views and climbing, and every major news outlet is picking up the story." Harrison felt bile rise in his throat as he watched his life's work crumble because of Connor's entitled behavior and his own failure as a father to instill basic human decency in the boy who was supposed to inherit the airline empire. The irony was devastating. They had assaulted and humiliated the very investor whose signature could have saved them from bankruptcy. "Where is Connor now?" Harrison asked through gritted teeth, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that executives learn to modulate when everything they've built is falling apart due to circumstances that should have been preventable. "Still in the air," replied Peter Michaels, Harrison's executive assistant, who had been fielding increasingly frantic calls from board members, regulatory agencies, and journalists seeking comment on the viral video. "Flight 882 isn't scheduled to land for another 90 minutes, and they turned off the Wi-Fi mid-flight to prevent passengers from accessing social media." Harrison laughed bitterly at the futility of trying to contain information in an age when every passenger carried a device capable of broadcasting injustice to millions of viewers within minutes of recording it. The airline industry's traditional approach of managing bad publicity through delayed response and corporate messaging was useless when faced with the instant accountability of viral social media. His phone rang with the distinctive tone he had programmed for emergency calls from board members, and Harrison reluctantly answered to hear the panicked voice of Chairman Robert Ashford, a man who had never experienced anything more stressful than choosing wine for board dinners, but was now facing the complete collapse of his investment portfolio. Harrison, what the hell is happening? Robert's voice cracked with the kind of fear that wealthy men experience when their money stops protecting them from consequences. My phone hasn't stopped ringing with calls from investors who want explanations for why our airline is assaulting children on viral videos. The stock is down 60% in Asian trading. Robert, we're dealing with a passenger service incident that has been blown out of proportion by social media, Harrison said weakly, knowing that his attempt to minimize the situation sounded pathetic even to his own ears when confronted with the visual evidence of Port Authority officers dragging a passenger down an airplane aisle while his 8-year-old son watched in terror. Blown out of proportion, Robert's voice rose to a near shriek. Harrison, I just watched a video of your son calling passengers trash, while uniformed officers assault a man for sitting in a seat he purchased. This isn't a passenger service incident. This is a public relations apocalypse that's going to cost us everything we've invested in this company. Harrison closed his eyes and tried to remember when Connor had transformed from a mischievous child into the entitled monster who had just destroyed decades of careful business development through a few minutes of racist tantrum, but he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when his son had become irredeemable. Margaret looked up from her laptop with an expression of barely controlled panic. Sir, we're getting reports that Titanium Ledger is preparing a statement. Our contacts in their legal department are suggesting they're not just withdrawing from the merger, they're calling in the debt immediately. The words hit Harrison like physical blows because he understood their implications better than anyone else in the room. Elijah Thorne wasn't just walking away from a business deal. He was actively destroying AeroVantage through the kind of financial warfare that private equity firms use to eliminate companies that had offended them personally or professionally. How much do we owe them? Harrison asked quietly, though he already knew the answer would be more than the airline could possibly raise through emergency financing given their current financial position and the reputational damage from the viral video. $1.2 billion due on demand with 24 hours notice, Margaret said in a voice barely above a whisper, the sum representing every major loan and credit facility that kept AeroVantage operational on a daily basis. Without the merger proceeds, we don't have anything close to that amount available in liquid assets. Harrison felt the room spinning as he processed the scope of the disaster Connor had created through his refusal to accept that other passengers had rights equal to his own. 30 years of building airline routes, acquiring aircraft, developing customer loyalty, and maintaining regulatory compliance would disappear because his son couldn't tolerate sitting in seat 2B instead of seat 1A. The irony was so profound it would have been amusing if it weren't destroying thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in shareholder value. The passenger Connor had dismissed as unworthy of first-class treatment was the only person in the world with both the financial resources and legal authority to save AeroVantage from bankruptcy. "Get me Thorne on the phone," Harrison said, desperately grasping at the slim possibility that private negotiations might salvage something from the wreckage of their business relationship. "I'll apologize personally, fire everyone involved, offer whatever compensation he demands. There has to be a way to fix this." Peter shook his head grimly. "Sir, Titanium Ledger's communications department issued a statement 10 minutes ago. They're not taking calls from AeroVantage personnel, and they've referred all inquiries to their legal team for bankruptcy proceedings." The finality of the statement settled over the boardroom like a funeral shroud, carrying the unmistakable message that Elijah Thorne had moved beyond anger into the kind of cold calculation that characterized successful private equity investors who had learned to separate personal emotions from business decisions that destroyed companies and lives with equal efficiency. Harrison thought about the thousands of AeroVantage employees who would lose their jobs, the passengers who would be stranded when operations ceased, the investors who would lose everything they had trusted him to protect and grow. All because Connor couldn't understand that dignity and respect weren't determined by family connections or assumptions about who deserved luxury accommodations. As if summoned by his thoughts, Margaret's phone chimed with a news alert that made her face go white. "Sir, Titanium Ledger just announced they're taking short positions against our stock." They're not just calling in the debt, they're actively betting on our collapse while making sure it happens. The revelation completed Harrison's understanding of how thoroughly Connor had destroyed their family's legacy through a few minutes of racist entitlement. Elijah Thorne was going to profit from AeroVantage's destruction, while ensuring that every person involved in his humiliation faced consequences that matched the severity of their actions. The first thing Connor Blackwood noticed as Flight 882 descended through the gray clouds surrounding Heathrow Airport was the unusual number of vehicles with flashing lights positioned around the terminal. Though his privileged mindset immediately assumed the emergency response was for some important passenger who deserved the kind of VIP treatment he had always received as the son of an airline CEO, Connor stretched luxuriously in seat 1. The window seat he had fought so viciously to obtain, completely unaware that his tantrum had been recorded and broadcast to millions of viewers who were now following the story with the kind of fascination that people reserve for watching entitled bullies receive long overdue consequences for their behavior. The 7-hour flight had passed pleasantly for Connor, who had enjoyed the premium service while remaining blissfully ignorant of the financial and reputational catastrophe that was destroying his family's business empire in real time across multiple continents and time zones. Captain Calloway had maintained the Wi-Fi blackout throughout the flight, ostensibly due to technical difficulties, but actually in a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable reckoning. Flight attendant Monica Wells moved through the first-class cabin with barely concealed anxiety, her professional composure cracking under the weight of knowing that her career and the entire airline were collapsing because of the ugly scene she had facilitated through her own prejudices and assumptions about which passengers deserved accommodation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into London, Heathrow," Captain Calloway announced over the intercom, his voice steady despite knowing that his own career was ending along with the flight. "Local time is 10:30 a.m. and the weather is typical. London overcast with light rain. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival." Connor felt the familiar satisfaction that came from getting exactly what he wanted through the application of pressure and family influence, believing that his successful acquisition of Seat 1A represented a normal exercise of privilege rather than a destructive act of discrimination that had triggered an international incident. As the Boeing 777 touched down on the wet runway, Connor noticed that the emergency vehicles seemed to be following their specific aircraft, rather than responding to a general airport incident. But his narcissistic worldview couldn't conceive of any scenario where he might be the target of law enforcement attention. Probably some terrorist threat or security concern. Connor mused to Monica as she collected his empty champagne glass, his tone suggesting that such problems were minor inconveniences that didn't affect people of his social status. "Good thing we have proper security procedures to deal with undesirable passengers who might cause trouble." Monica forced a tight smile while internally calculating whether her 25 years of airline service had been worth the pension she would never receive now that AeroVantage was bankrupt, destroyed by her own participation in the discrimination that had triggered Elijah Thorne's devastating financial retaliation. The aircraft taxied to the gate with an unusual escort of ground vehicles, and Connor noticed that the jet bridge wasn't extending to meet their door, despite the engines shutting down and the seatbelt sign being turned off. Instead, uniformed personnel were gathering at the gate entrance in numbers that seemed excessive for routine customs and immigration procedures. "What's the delay?" Connor asked impatiently, checking his gold Rolex and calculating how much time he would need to reach his father's office for their scheduled lunch meeting, where they would discuss Connor's potential promotion within the airline hierarchy. "I have important business meetings that can't wait for whatever bureaucratic nonsense is causing this holdup." Captain Calloway emerged from the cockpit, looking haggard and defeated. His usual commanding presence replaced by the posture of a man who knew his professional reputation had been permanently destroyed by 30 minutes of bad judgment and corporate cowardice in the face of entitled passengers who demanded special treatment. The aircraft door finally opened, but instead of the usual ground crew and gate agents, 3 serious-looking men in expensive suits entered the first-class cabin, followed by uniformed Metropolitan Police officers, whose presence immediately altered the atmosphere from routine arrival processing to something far more ominous and official. Connor Blackwood asked Detective Inspector James Morrison, a man whose soft-spoken manner couldn't disguise the steel in his voice, as he approached Seat 1A with the deliberate pace of someone who had been looking forward to this moment since watching the viral video that morning. "That's me," Connor replied with his usual arrogant confidence, assuming that his family name would immediately clarify any confusion and result in the VIP treatment he had received throughout his privileged life. "If this is about airport security, my father can clear up whatever misunderstanding has occurred." Detective Inspector Morrison smiled grimly as he produced his identification, along with an arrest warrant that had been expedited through the British legal system with unusual speed due to the international attention focused on the case and the clear evidence of Connor's involvement in the discriminatory treatment of passengers. "Connor Blackwood, you are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud, insider trading, and violation of the Equality Act in connection with the incident aboard this aircraft." Detective Morrison announced formally, his words carrying the weight of a legal system that had been embarrassed by the international publicity surrounding British aviation's role in American civil rights violations. Connor's face drained of color as he processed words that made no sense according to his understanding of how the world worked for people of his social status and family connections. "This is insane. I've been asleep for 7 hours. I haven't committed any crimes. This is obviously some kind of mistake that my father's lawyers will clear up immediately." "Sir, your father resigned as CEO of Aerovantage Airlines approximately 4 hours ago, when the company filed for emergency bankruptcy proceedings," Detective Morrison explained with professional neutrality, delivering information that shattered Connor's understanding of reality with the efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. "Your stock options were liquidated this morning in violation of insider trading regulations, and the passenger you removed from this aircraft is the primary creditor whose investment withdrawal triggered the financial collapse." The words hit Connor like physical blows as he realized that his tantrum over an airplane seat had somehow destroyed the family business empire and transformed him from privileged heir into criminal defendant in the span of a single flight across the Atlantic Ocean. Sophia Rivers, who had been recording the arrival process from Seat 2, they couldn't resist offering commentary on Connor's arrest for the millions of viewers who were following the story through her live social media updates. "Ladies and gentlemen, karma has arrived at Heathrow Airport, and it's wearing handcuffs." Connor looked around the first-class cabin, desperately seeking some authority figure or family connection who could make this nightmare disappear through the application of wealth and influence. But he found only the disgusted faces of passengers who had witnessed his racist behavior and were now watching justice being served with the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing bullies finally face consequences. As Detective Morrison read Connor his rights while placing him in handcuffs, Connor's last coherent thought before his privileged world collapsed completely was the belated realization that the passenger he had dismissed as trash had somehow possessed the power to destroy everything his family had built through decades of careful business development and strategic investments. The release paperwork crinkled in Elijah's hands as he and Nathan walked through the automatic doors of the Port Authority police station into the cool New York morning air that carried the familiar mixture of exhaust fumes, coffee shops, and the distant salt smell of the harbor that defined the city's unique atmosphere. Nathan squinted in the bright sunlight after hours under fluorescent lights, his 8-year-old resilience already beginning to process the traumatic experience into something he could understand and learn from. Media vehicles lined the street outside the police station, their satellite dishes and camera crews creating a chaotic scene that suggested the story of their airport arrest had grown far beyond a simple passenger service dispute into something approaching a national conversation about discrimination. corporate accountability, and the abuse of power by those who believed their wealth granted them immunity from consequences. Dad. "Why are there so many people with cameras?" Nathan asked with the innocent curiosity that had characterized his approach to every new experience during their ordeal. His question highlighting the surreal transformation of their private humiliation into a public symbol of larger issues about race, class, and justice in contemporary America. Elijah felt overwhelmed by the scope of attention their situation had attracted, the weight of knowing that millions of people were watching and waiting to see how he would respond to the treatment they had received. Whether he would choose the path of vengeance that his wealth and influence made possible, or find some way to transform their pain into positive change that honored Charlotte's memory and values. Before he could answer Nathan's question, a familiar voice cut through the crowd of reporters and supporters who had gathered to witness their release from custody. "Elijah, Nathan, Judge Samuel Richardson pushed through the media scrum with the authority that came from 40 years on the federal bench and a lifetime of commanding respect through moral leadership rather than intimidation or wealth." Nathan's face lit up with genuine joy at seeing his grandfather figure the man who had been Charlotte's father and had helped raise him with the same values of dignity, compassion, and justice that had guided the family through every crisis since Charlotte's death 3 years earlier. Grandpa Judge Nathan called out, running into the arms of the man who had taught him about the law, fairness, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when doing so required courage and sacrifice that most people weren't willing to make for strangers or abstract principles. Judge Richardson embraced Nathan with the fierce protectiveness of a grandfather who had watched helplessly as his beloved grandson experienced adult cruelty and injustice. His weathered hands gentle as he checked for any signs of physical harm from their traumatic encounter with airport security and law enforcement. "Are you all right, son?" Judge Richardson asked Nathan with the kind of focused attention that made children feel heard and valued his voice, carrying decades of experience helping young people navigate complex legal and emotional situations that threatened to overwhelm their developing sense of justice and fairness. "I'm okay, Grandpa Judge, but they hurt Dad for sitting in our airplane seats, and I don't understand why grown-ups were so mean when we didn't do anything wrong," Nathan said with the plaintive confusion of a child whose faith in adult fairness had been shaken by witnessing arbitrary cruelty disguised as legitimate authority. Judge Richardson's expression hardened as he processed his grandson's words, his legendary judicial temperament strained by the knowledge that Nathan had been traumatized by adults who should have protected rather than persecuted a child, whose only crime was traveling with his father in seats they had legitimately purchased. Sometimes Nathan people forget the most important lessons about treating others with dignity and respect, but that doesn't mean those lessons aren't true, or that good people should stop trying to live by them. Judge Richardson said carefully, drawing on decades of experience explaining complex moral situations to children who had been hurt by adult failures. Elijah approached more slowly, still processing the emotional whiplash of going from criminal defendant to victim of documented discrimination in the span of a few hours, as public opinion rallied behind their cause and transformed them from troublemakers into symbols of injustice that demanded accountability and systemic change. "Samuel, thank you for coming," Elijah said gratefully, embracing the man who had become his moral compass and source of wisdom since Charlotte's death, especially during moments when the temptation to use his wealth and power for destructive purposes threatened to overwhelm the better angels of his nature. "Of course I came," Judge Richardson replied firmly, his tone carrying the implicit message that family loyalty and moral duty required him to support Elijah and Nathan, regardless of any inconvenience or public attention that might result from his involvement in their situation. They climbed into Judge Richardson's car, a modest sedan that reflected his lifelong commitment to public service rather than personal enrichment, and drove in relative silence toward his Manhattan townhouse, while Nathan processed the morning's events with the serious expression he wore when learning difficult lessons about the gap between how the world should work and how it actually functioned. "Dad, can I ask Grandpa Judge about something Mom wrote in her letter?" Nathan said quietly, unconsciously touching the silver locket that contained Charlotte's final words of wisdom and guidance for navigating the moral complexities that would inevitably challenge him as he grew into adulthood. Elijah felt his heart constrict at the mention of Charlotte's letter, the one she had written during her final hospital stay when she knew her time was limited, and wanted to leave Nathan with guidance for making difficult decisions about forgiveness, justice, and choosing healing over hatred when faced with people who had hurt him. "Of course," son Elijah said softly, realizing that this traumatic experience might be the moment when Nathan needed his mother's wisdom more than any other time since her death, when the theoretical lessons about dignity and compassion would be tested against real-world cruelty and the desire for revenge. Nathan carefully opened the silver locket and unfolded the small piece of paper that contained Charlotte's handwritten message, her words as precious and powerful now as they had been when she wrote them while fighting for every moment she could spend with the family she loved more than her own life. "My darling Nathan," Nathan read aloud in his clear 8-year-old voice. "If you're reading this, it means you're facing something difficult and you need help deciding what to do. Remember that when people hurt you, you always have two choices. You can hurt them back, or you can choose to heal forward. Hurting back feels good for a moment, but healing forward makes the world better forever. I know you'll choose to heal forward because you have your father's strength and your grandmother's heart, and together they make you capable of changing the world through love instead of anger. Choose love, my sweet boy. Always choose love." The words hung in the car like a benediction. Charlotte's voice speaking through Nathan with the kind of moral clarity that cut through all the complexity and confusion surrounding their situation to reveal the essential choice between destruction and transformation, between using their pain to hurt others or finding a way to prevent future families from experiencing similar trauma. Judge Richardson wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, overwhelmed by his daughter's posthumous wisdom and her ability to guide her family toward healing even from beyond the grave, her values living on through Nathan's innocent but profound understanding of the choice they faced. "Your mother was the wisest person I ever knew," Judge Richardson said with a thickness in his voice that betrayed the depth of his grief for the daughter he had lost, and his pride in the grandson who carried her legacy forward through his own choices and actions. Nathan looked at his father with Charlotte's eyes and asked the question that would determine everything that happened next. "Dad, how do we heal forward from what happened to us today? How do we make it so other kids don't have to watch their parents get hurt for no reason?" The question embodied everything Charlotte had taught them about finding purpose in pain and using personal experiences of injustice to create positive change, rather than simply seeking revenge against those who had caused harm. And Elijah realized that his 8-year-old son had just shown him the path forward that honored both Charlotte's memory and the values she had died trying to instill in both of them. The mahogany-paneled study in Judge Richardson's Manhattan townhouse carried the weight of 4 decades of legal scholarship and moral reflection. Its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes on constitutional law, civil rights, and ethical philosophy that had guided some of the most important judicial decisions of the late 20th century. Afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air while Nathan sat at the antique desk where his grandmother had once graded papers as a philosophy professor at Columbia University. Nathan worked quietly on his origami sculptures, creating small paper cranes with the focused concentration that helped him process complex emotions and think through problems that seemed overwhelming to the adults around him. Each precise fold represented his attempt to create something beautiful from something ordinary, a metaphor that Charlotte had taught him for transforming difficult experiences into opportunities for growth and learning. Elijah sat across from Judge Richardson in worn leather chairs that had witnessed countless conversations about justice, mercy, and the delicate balance between holding people accountable for their actions while still believing in their capacity for redemption and change. The weight of decision hung between them as they discussed the various paths forward, each carrying different implications for healing versus retribution. "The legal case is straightforward," Judge Richardson said quietly, reviewing the documentation that Elijah's attorneys had compiled within hours of their release from police custody. "Civil rights violations assault unlawful imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, particularly involving a minor child. Any competent lawyer could secure a settlement in the tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions, given the viral nature of the incident and the corporate liability issues." Elijah nodded grimly, understanding that the legal system offered him multiple avenues for extracting financial revenge against Connor Blackwood, Captain Calloway, Monica Wells, and AeroVantage Airlines, but questioning whether such victories would honor Charlotte's memory or simply perpetuate cycles of harm that ultimately hurt more innocent people than guilty ones. "And the financial leverage?" Elijah asked, though he already knew the answer from his conversations with Sarah Jenkins, who had spent the morning executing the debt recall that would force AeroVantage into bankruptcy within days, unless some miracle intervention occurred to provide alternative financing. "Total destruction," Judge Richardson said bluntly, his judicial experience providing him with clear-eyed assessment of corporate vulnerabilities and the cascading effects of financial warfare in interconnected global markets. "The airline employs 43,000 people globally, serves millions of passengers annually, and supports countless suppliers, contractors, and local economies. Calling in the debt immediately will devastate all of those stakeholders, most of whom had nothing to do with what happened to you and Nathan." Nathan looked up from his origami work, his 8-year-old ears catching the implications of their conversation, even though he didn't fully understand the complex financial mechanisms that allowed his father to destroy an entire company through the stroke of a pen on legal documents that most people never saw or comprehended. "Dad, if we make the airplane company disappear, what happens to all the people who work there?" Nathan asked, with the innocent directness that children bring to moral questions that adults often obscure through technical language and procedural complexity. The question cut straight to the heart of Elijah's internal conflict between the desire for revenge against those who had hurt his son and the recognition that his financial power carried responsibilities toward innocent people whose lives would be destroyed if he chose the path of maximum retaliation rather than seeking some form of restorative justice. Those people would lose their jobs. Nathan. Elijah said honestly, recognizing that his son deserved truthful answers, even when the truth revealed the devastating scope of the choice he faced between personal satisfaction and broader social responsibility. Nathan frowned with the concentration he showed when working through complex ethical problems. "But they didn't hurt us. Only a few people hurt us. Why would we hurt people who weren't even there?" Judge Richardson felt his heart swell with pride at his grandson's moral clarity, recognizing Charlotte's influence in Nathan's ability to distinguish between individual accountability and collective punishment, between justice that targeted actual wrongdoers and revenge that damaged innocent bystanders. "That's exactly the right question," Nathan Judge Richardson said warmly, his voice carrying decades of experience helping young people develop ethical reasoning skills that would guide them through life's most difficult decisions. "Your mother would be very proud of how you're thinking about this problem." Elijah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city street where life continued normally for people who hadn't spent the morning being arrested and humiliated for sitting in airplane seats. They had purchased people whose families weren't facing the choice between destruction and forgiveness on a scale that would affect thousands of lives. "There might be another option," Elijah said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke, influenced by Nathan's questions and Charlotte's posthumous guidance about choosing healing over hurting, even when the desire for revenge felt justified and satisfying. What kind of option? Judge Richardson asked, his curiosity piqued by the thoughtful tone in Elijah's voice that suggested he was moving beyond purely punitive responses towards something more constructive and transformative. What if we use this moment to create change instead of just punishment? Elijah said, turning back to face his father-in-law and son, his voice carrying the tentative hope of someone discovering a path that honored both justice and mercy. What if we require AeroVantage and everyone involved to participate in a process that addresses the underlying issues that created today's situation? Nathan's eyes lit up with interest as he processed his father's words. You mean like when I have to apologize and learn why what I did was wrong when I make mistakes? Something like that, son, but for grown-ups who need to understand why their behavior hurt people and how they can do better in the future, Elijah said, feeling Charlotte's presence in their conversation as strongly as if she were sitting beside them offering her wisdom about education versus punishment. Judge Richardson leaned forward in his chair, his decades of experience with restorative justice programs informing his understanding of what Elijah was proposing. You're talking about facilitated dialogue, accountability processes, maybe educational requirements for the individuals involved, and policy changes for the institution. Exactly, Elijah said with growing conviction, realizing that this approach offered a way to honor Nathan's traumatic experience while creating positive change that could prevent other families from facing similar discrimination and abuse. We use our leverage not to destroy them, but to transform them. Nathan carefully set down his origami paper and looked at his father with an expression of mature consideration that seemed far beyond his 8 years. Dad, do you think the mean people could learn to be nice people if someone taught them how? The question embodied Charlotte's fundamental faith in human capacity for growth and redemption. Her belief that even people who acted cruelly could change if given proper guidance and held accountable for their actions in ways that promoted learning rather than simple punishment. I think your mother believed that everyone has the potential to become better if they're willing to do the hard work of examining their behavior and changing their hearts, Elijah said softly, feeling the truth of Charlotte's philosophy, even as part of him still wanted to use his power to crush those who had hurt his son. Judge Richardson smiled with the satisfaction of a grandfather watching his family choose the difficult path of wisdom over the easy path of revenge. There are established programs for this kind of intervention, mediated dialogue processes that bring together people who have been harmed with those who caused the harm, along with neutral facilitators who guide conversations toward understanding and accountability. Would I get to talk to the people who hurt Dad? Nathan asked with curiosity rather than fear, his 8-year-old mind viewing the situation as a problem to be solved rather than a wound to be nursed through eternal grievance. If you wanted to, and if everyone agreed to participate. Judge Richardson said carefully, recognizing that Nathan's involvement would be crucial to any successful restorative process, while also ensuring that his emotional well-being remained the primary consideration in any decisions about structure and participation. Nathan nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that would guide everything that happened next. Could we make sure they understand why what they did was wrong so they never hurt other kids, like they hurt us? Elijah felt tears sting his eyes as he recognized Charlotte speaking through their son, her commitment to education and transformation, living on through Nathan's innocent but profound desire to prevent future suffering, rather than simply punishing past wrongs. Yes, Nathan Elijah said with the quiet certainty that comes from making decisions that align with deeply held values, even when they require more courage and effort than simpler alternatives. I think we can make sure they understand. The conference room at the Manhattan Mediation Center smelled of fresh coffee and nervous anticipation. Its neutral beige walls and comfortable seating arranged in a circle designed to promote equality and openness rather than the hierarchical dynamics that characterized most business meetings or legal proceedings. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Central Park, where autumn leaves created a tapestry of gold and red that seemed to promise renewal and transformation for those willing to embrace difficult conversations. Dr. Patricia Williams, one of the nation's leading experts in restorative justice and racial reconciliation, had flown in from Berkeley specifically to facilitate this unprecedented dialogue between victims of discrimination and the corporate leaders whose actions had created national controversy and personal trauma. Her calm presence and decades of experience guiding difficult conversations provided the steady foundation necessary for genuine accountability and potential healing. Nathan sat between his father and Judge Richardson, wearing his best navy blazer and the serious expression he displayed when preparing for important conversations that required his full attention and emotional intelligence. In his small hands, he held one of his origami cranes, folding and refolding the paper wings with the kind of nervous energy that helped him process complex situations and prepare for challenging social interactions. Across the circle sat Harrison Blackwood, looking haggard and defeated after losing his life's work within 24 hours of his son's airplane tantrum, his expensive suit unable to disguise the weight of shame and financial ruin that had transformed him from powerful CEO into a broken man seeking some form of redemption that might salvage meaning from the wreckage of his legacy. Connor Blackwood attended via video conference from his London holding cell, his face pale and drawn as he faced the real-world consequences of behavior that had always been enabled by wealth and family influence, but had finally met its match in the form of viral accountability and legal justice that couldn't be purchased or intimidated. Monica Wells sat rigidly in her chair, her 25 years of airline service culminating in unemployment and professional disgrace, her participation in the dialogue representing her only hope for some form of personal redemption, even though her career and pension had been sacrificed to corporate liability management and public relations damage control. Captain Richard Calloway appeared via secure video link from the rehabilitation facility where he was receiving treatment for alcohol dependency that had been revealed during the investigation into his decision-making. During the flight incident, his pilot's license permanently revoked along with his career and professional reputation. "Before we begin," Dr. Williams said in her calm, measured voice that immediately commanded attention and respect from all participants, "I want to establish some ground rules for our conversation. We're here to listen, to understand, to acknowledge harm that was caused, and to explore possibilities for healing and positive change. This is not a legal proceeding, not a negotiation for financial settlements, not an opportunity for public shaming or revenge." Nathan raised his hand with the polite attention-seeking behavior Charlotte had taught him for classroom situations. "Ma'am, may I say something first, Doctor?" Williams smiled warmly at the 8-year-old who had become the moral center of this complex situation through his innocence and wisdom. "Of course, Nathan. What would you like to share?" Nathan stood up with the dignity that had impressed adults throughout this ordeal, his small voice carrying clearly through the room as he addressed people who had caused him trauma with the kind of grace that revealed character far beyond his years. "My mom died when I was 5, and before she died, she wrote me a letter about choosing to heal forward instead of hurting back. When people are mean to you," Nathan said with the careful pronunciation of a child who had practiced important words to make sure adults understood his meaning, "I want everyone to know that even though you scared me and hurt my dad, I don't hate you. I just want to understand why you did it and make sure it doesn't happen to other kids." The words hit the room like a physical force, stripping away defensive postures and legal strategies to reveal the human cost of discrimination and the moral challenge presented by a child who had chosen forgiveness over vengeance, despite having every reason to demand punishment for those who had traumatized him. Harrison Blackwood began crying silently, his shoulders shaking as the reality of what his corporate culture and personal failures had done to an innocent child penetrated the emotional defenses he had constructed around his business decisions and parenting choices. Nathan Harrison said through his tears, his voice breaking with genuine remorse that couldn't be manufactured or strategized by public relations consultants. I am so deeply sorry for what my son and my airline's employees did to you and your father. There is no excuse, no justification, no explanation that makes it acceptable to treat you the way you were treated. Connor's face on the video screen showed confusion and defensive anger as he struggled to process Nathan's grace and his father's emotional collapse. His worldview built on entitlement and superiority, challenged by an 8-year-old's demonstration of moral strength that exceeded his own by every measure. I still don't understand what we did that was so terrible, Connor said, with the petulance of someone who had never been required to examine his behavior or consider its impact on others. We just wanted our regular seat, and they were being stubborn about moving, when any reasonable person would have accommodated a simple request from valued customers. Nathan looked directly at Connor, through the video connection, his 8-year-old directness cutting through layers of rationalization and self-justification that adults used to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about their character and choices. Mr. Connor, why did you think you deserved our seats more than we did? Nathan asked with genuine curiosity rather than accusation. We had tickets for those seats, and you had a ticket for a different seat. What made you more important than my dad and me? The question exposed the fundamental assumption underlying Connor's behavior, that some people were inherently more valuable than others based on family connections, racial identity, and class status, while challenging him to articulate beliefs that sounded obviously wrong when stated explicitly to a child who had been harmed by their application. Connor's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find language that would justify his actions without revealing the racist and classist attitudes that had motivated his demand for differential treatment based on his assumptions about who belonged in first-class accommodations. Monica Wells found her voice for the first time since the session began, her guilt and shame compelling her to offer some form of accountability for her role in escalating a simple misunderstanding into a violent confrontation that traumatized a child. Nathan, I made assumptions about you and your father based on how you were dressed and what I thought people in first class should look like. Monica said quietly, her words carrying the weight of 25 years of unconscious bias that had influenced countless passenger interactions. I was wrong to treat you differently than other passengers, and I'm sorry that my prejudices contributed to your frightening experience. Nathan nodded thoughtfully, processing Monica's apology with the seriousness he brought to all important conversations. Mrs. Monica, did you know that making assumptions was wrong, or did you think you were following the rules? The question revealed Nathan's intuitive understanding of the difference between malicious intent and unconscious bias, between people who deliberately chose to harm others and those who caused harm through unexamined assumptions and cultural conditioning that had never been challenged or corrected. I thought I was doing my job correctly, Monica admitted with painful honesty. But I realize now that I had learned the wrong lessons about who deserved respect and accommodation. I should have treated you exactly the same way I would treat any other passengers with valid tickets. Dr. Williams observed the interaction with professional admiration for Nathan's ability to create space for authentic accountability without shaming or attacking people who were genuinely trying to understand and acknowledge their mistakes, recognizing that the 8-year-old possessed natural facilitation skills that many adults never developed. Nathan, Dr. Williams said gently, "How does it feel to hear these apologies and explanations? What do you need from the people who hurt you in order to begin healing?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, folding his origami crane with careful precision while he considered the question that would ultimately determine whether this dialogue process could achieve the transformation that his mother's letter had envisioned. I need them to promise that they'll learn how to see kids like me as regular kids who deserve to sit in airplane seats with their dads, Nathan said finally, his words carrying the simplicity and power of a child's understanding of justice. And I need them to teach other grown-ups so this doesn't happen to other families. The request embodied Charlotte's vision of healing that extended beyond individual apologies toward educational change that could prevent future harm, transforming personal trauma into protective knowledge that would benefit countless strangers who would never know about Nathan's sacrifice or the wisdom he had gained through suffering. 3 months of weekly dialogue sessions had transformed the sterile conference room at the Manhattan Mediation Center into a space where genuine human connection had gradually replaced defensive posturing and legal maneuvering, where the initial hostility and shame had evolved into something approaching mutual understanding and shared commitment to preventing future harm through education rather than punishment. Nathan had become the unofficial moral compass for the group, his 8-year-old questions consistently cutting through adult complexity and rationalization to reveal fundamental issues about dignity, respect, and the assumptions that adults made about children based on their appearance, family background, and perceived social status. During Session 7, Connor Blackwood had finally broken down completely when Nathan asked him to explain what he had hoped to gain by calling an 8-year-old child trash in front of a cabin full of strangers who were recording his behavior for millions of viewers to judge and condemn through viral social media platforms that had made his cruelty globally visible. "I wanted to hurt you because you were sitting in something I wanted, and I thought making you feel small would make me feel bigger." Connor had admitted through tears that seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else in the room, his honesty representing the first crack in the entitled worldview that had guided his behavior throughout his privileged life. Nathan had responded with the kind of profound simplicity that children often brought to adult problems. "But Mr. Connor, hurting people doesn't actually make you bigger. It just makes everyone smaller, including you." The observation had catalyzed Connor's recognition that his entire approach to getting what he wanted had been fundamentally destructive not just to his victims, but to his own character and potential for genuine human connection, leading him to request individual therapy sessions focused on understanding and addressing the insecurity that drove his need to dominate and humiliate others. During Session 12, Monica Wells had presented a detailed analysis of AeroVantage's training protocols and corporate culture, revealing how unconscious bias had been systematically reinforced through customer service guidelines that encouraged flight attendants to make judgments about passenger worthiness based on appearance, demeanor, and perceived ability to pay premium prices for luxury accommodations. "We were taught to profile passengers for security purposes. But somewhere along the way, that training became about judging who deserved our best service versus who could be pressured into accepting less than what they had paid for," Monica explained with the painful self-awareness that came from examining decades of professional practices that she had never questioned until Nathan's trauma forced her to confront their human cost. Nathan had listened carefully to Monica's presentation before asking the question that would ultimately reshape airline industry training standards. "Ms. Monica, what if you treated every passenger like they were someone's most precious person? Like they were someone's dad or mom or kid who deserved to get home safely and happily?" The question had inspired Monica to develop new training curricula based on empathy and human dignity, rather than risk assessment and customer segmentation programs that would eventually be implemented across multiple airlines as the industry grappled with the systemic changes demanded by Nathan's case and the public attention it had generated. Harrison Blackwood's transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic, his evolution from corporate autocrat to genuine advocate for organizational change, driven by his recognition that Connor's behavior reflected leadership failures and cultural problems that extended far beyond individual prejudice to encompass the entire business model that prioritized profit over human dignity. "I built a company that valued money more than people," Harrison had admitted during Session 15, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of business decisions that had prioritized shareholder value over employee welfare and customer respect. "Connor learned his values from watching how I treated people who couldn't fight back, how I justified discrimination as sound business practice when it served our financial interests." Nathan had processed this confession with the thoughtful expression he wore when learning about complex adult subjects that required moral rather than intellectual understanding. Mr. Harrison, if you could build your company again, what would you do differently to make sure kids like me felt safe and welcome? The question had launched Harrison's development of comprehensive corporate reform proposals that went beyond simple policy changes to address fundamental questions about business, ethics, stakeholder responsibilities, and the role of leadership in creating organizational cultures that either promoted or prevented discrimination based on race, class, and other irrelevant characteristics. Captain Calloway's participation had been limited by his ongoing rehabilitation for alcohol dependency that had clouded his judgment during the flight incident, but his written reflections on authority, responsibility, and the abuse of power had provided valuable insights into how professional hierarchies could either protect or endanger vulnerable passengers depending on the values and training of those who wielded authority within aviation systems. I used my position to silence someone who was trying to protect his child instead of using it to protect both the child and the passenger who was being discriminated against, Calloway had written in his 10th week of treatment. I chose to support prejudice because it seemed easier than challenging someone with family connections to my employer, and that choice will haunt me for the rest of my life because it caused real harm to real people. Nathan had dictated a response letter with his father's help offering forgiveness, while also requesting that Captain Calloway help develop pilot training programs focused on recognizing and interrupting discrimination during flight operations, transforming his professional failure into educational opportunity that could protect future passengers from similar trauma. Dr. Williams had documented each session with meticulous care, recognizing that the dialogue process was creating unprecedented insights into restorative justice applications for corporate discrimination cases, while demonstrating the powerful role that child victims could play in guiding adult accountability and transformation when their voices were heard and respected rather than patronized or ignored. Nathan has shown us that healing isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter. Dr. Williams had noted in her case summary, it's about transforming painful experiences into protective knowledge that prevents future harm while maintaining faith in human capacity for growth and change, even among people who have caused significant damage through their choices and actions. As the sessions progressed toward their conclusion, each participant had developed specific commitments for continuing the work of transformation beyond the formal dialogue process. Commitments that honored Nathan's trauma, while channeling it toward positive change that would benefit countless other families who would never know how an 8-year-old boy's wisdom had made their travel experiences safer and more dignified. The gleaming conference room on the 45th floor of the Titanium Ledger building buzzed with an energy that felt both productive and redemptive as representatives from Aerovantage Airline's civil rights organizations, federal aviation authorities, and employee unions gathered around an expansive table to finalize the comprehensive reform agreement that would transform Nathan's traumatic experience into systematic change, protecting future passengers from discrimination and abuse. Nathan sat in a specially adjusted chair between his father and Judge Richardson, his small notebook filled with crayon drawings that illustrated his ideas for making airplanes friendly for all families, through policy changes that addressed everything from staff training to passenger complaint procedures to the design of seating areas that promoted dignity rather than hierarchy. The transformation of the key players had been remarkable to witness over the preceding months of dialogue and collaborative problem-solving. Harrison Blackwood, stripped of his CEO title but retained as a consultant for the reform process, had evolved from corporate autocrat into passionate advocate for organizational change, his shame and remorse channeled into detailed proposals for eliminating discriminatory practices throughout the aviation industry. Connor Blackwood appeared via video conference from London, where he was serving community service at a refugee assistance center as part of his plea agreement. His entitled arrogance replaced by genuine humility as he worked with families who had experienced far greater trauma than his airline tantrum had caused. but who still maintained hope and dignity, despite their circumstances. Nathan, would you like to share your latest ideas about passenger dignity programs? Asked Dr. Williams, who had continued facilitating the group's work as it evolved from personal healing toward systematic reform that could influence industry practices across multiple airlines and transportation companies. Nathan stood carefully and opened his notebook to a page covered with stick figure drawings of diverse families boarding airplanes together, his 8-year-old artistic vision depicting a world where children of all backgrounds could travel safely with their parents without fear of harassment or discrimination based on assumptions about who deserved respectful treatment. I drew pictures of how airplanes should work, Nathan said in his clear voice that had become familiar to everyone in the room through months of collaboration and shared commitment to honoring his trauma through meaningful change. Every family gets treated the same nice way, and the airplane workers ask questions instead of making guesses about people. And there are special people whose job is just to make sure kids feel safe and happy when they're flying. The concept he described, passenger advocacy specialists focused specifically on children's welfare and family dignity, had emerged from Nathan's recognition that adult authority figures often intimidated children even when they were trying to be helpful, creating a need for specially trained staff who understood how to communicate with young passengers and address their concerns without causing additional anxiety or fear. Harrison leaned forward with the intense focus he now brought to discussions about operational improvement, his business acumen redirected toward creating value through inclusion rather than exclusion. Nathan, how would these special airplane workers know when a child needed help or protection from other grown-ups who might be acting inappropriately? Nathan considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all important topics, his 8-year-old mind working through complex social dynamics that adults often overlooked in their focus on efficiency and profit margins rather than human experience and emotional safety. They could watch for kids who look scared or confused, and they could ask kids questions in private to make sure they're okay. And they could have special signals that kids could use to ask for help if grown-ups were being mean. But the kids were afraid to speak up, Nathan said thoughtfully, his suggestions revealing sophisticated understanding of power dynamics and the vulnerability that children experienced in adult-controlled environments like airports and aircraft. Monica Wells, who had been working for months to develop new training curricula based on the insights gained through the dialogue process, took careful notes as Nathan spoke, recognizing that his perspective as a victim of adult prejudice provided crucial information about how policies and procedures felt to the children they were designed to protect. "That's exactly right," Nathan Monica said warmly, her voice carrying genuine respect for his contributions rather than the patronizing tone adults often used when acknowledging children's ideas. "We've been working on training programs that teach airline workers to recognize signs of passenger distress and intervene appropriately. But your ideas about child-specific advocacy add an important element we hadn't fully developed." Federal Aviation Administration Representative Director Sarah Chen had been quietly documenting the conversation for the regulatory report that would determine whether the reforms developed through this collaboration would become mandatory across the commercial aviation industry, her presence representing government recognition that Nathan's case had exposed systematic problems requiring federal oversight and enforcement. The FAA is prepared to support pilot programs implementing these child advocacy positions at major airlines. Director Chen announced her words carrying the weight of federal authority behind the changes that Nathan's wisdom had inspired. "We believe the documentation and accountability measures you've developed could significantly improve passenger safety and satisfaction while reducing liability exposure for airlines that implement them properly." Connor's face on the video screen showed genuine surprise at the scope of change that had emerged from his airplane tantrum, his perspective altered by months of working with refugee families who had taught him about real hardship and the difference between genuine suffering and the manufactured grievances of privileged people who confused minor inconveniences with actual injustice. "I never imagined that my behavior would lead to something this comprehensive," Connor said, with the humility that had replaced his former arrogance, his voice carrying authentic remorse rather than the performative apology he had initially offered when confronted with the consequences of his actions. "Nathan, I want you to know that working with families who have lost everything has taught me what real problems look like, and I'm grateful that you chose to help people instead of just punishing me." Nathan looked at Connor through the video connection with the forgiveness that had characterized his approach throughout the entire process, his capacity for grace continuing to amaze the adults who had witnessed his transformation of personal trauma into collective healing. "Mr. Connor, my mom said that mistakes are only bad if we don't learn from them," Nathan replied simply, his words carrying Charlotte's wisdom about redemption and the possibility of positive change even among people who had caused significant harm through their choices and actions. "I think you learned important things, so your mistake became a good thing that helps other people." Judge Richardson felt tears sting his eyes as he listened to his grandson channel Charlotte's philosophical approach to human nature and moral development, recognizing that Nathan's response to trauma had honored his mother's memory while creating legacy that extended far beyond their family to influence systems and policies that would protect countless other children and families. The final agreement document, which would be signed in a public ceremony attended by civil rights leaders, aviation industry executives, and government officials, represented unprecedented collaboration between victims of discrimination and the institutional actors who had caused harm, demonstrating that restorative justice approaches could achieve systematic change while maintaining human dignity and relationship building, rather than relying solely on punishment and adversarial legal proceedings. As the meeting concluded with commitments for implementation timelines, oversight mechanisms, and evaluation criteria that would measure success through reduced discrimination complaints and increased passenger satisfaction across demographic categories. Nathan carefully closed his notebook and looked around the table at adults who had learned to see him as a teacher rather than merely a victim of their failures. "Thank you all for helping make airplanes safer for kids like me," Nathan said, with the grace that had guided his response to trauma from the beginning, his words representing not just appreciation for their work, but recognition that healing required collaborative effort from everyone involved in creating both problems and solutions. The magnificent chambers of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee buzzed with an energy that felt both solemn and transformative as members of Congress, aviation industry executives, civil rights advocates, and media representatives gathered to witness testimony from the 8-year-old boy whose airplane ordeal had catalyzed the most comprehensive review of discrimination in commercial aviation since the industry's deregulation 40 years earlier. Nathan sat at the witness table that had been adjusted to accommodate his small stature, his legs barely reaching the floor, despite the special booster seat that congressional staff had provided to ensure his comfort and dignity during what many observers were already calling historic testimony that would influence federal policy for decades to come. The silver locket containing Charlotte's letter rested against Nathan's chest beneath his navy blue suit, purchased specifically for this occasion, but somehow managing to make him look like what he was: a serious, thoughtful child who had been thrust into national prominence through adult failures but had chosen to respond with wisdom that exceeded the moral understanding of many people 4 times his age. Chairman Rodriguez, a veteran legislator with 30 years of experience conducting high-stakes hearings, looked down at Nathan with a mixture of respect and amazement that a child could command the attention of the most powerful transportation officials in the federal government, simply by refusing to accept discrimination as normal or inevitable. Nathan Thorne, Chairman Rodriguez, began in his formal hearing voice, "Thank you for agreeing to share your experience with this committee. Before we begin, I want you to know that what happened to you and your father represents a failure of adult responsibility that should never have occurred, and we are here today to make sure it never happens again to any child or family." Nathan nodded politely, his 8-year-old composure remarkable given the circumstances and the gravity of the moment as he prepared to address representatives who held the power to transform his personal trauma into federal legislation that would protect countless other passengers from similar treatment. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Nathan said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the chamber through the microphone system, while cameras captured every word for the millions of viewers who were following the hearing through live television and social media coverage. "I want to tell you what happened to my dad and me, and what we learned about making things better instead of just getting mad at people." The simple statement immediately established the tone that would characterize Nathan's testimony. Not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a young moral leader offering insights about transformation, education, and the possibility of positive change, even among people and institutions that had caused significant harm through their policies and practices. Committee member, Representative Sarah Williams herself, the mother of 3 young children, leaned into her microphone with visible emotion. "Nathan, can you tell us in your own words what happened on the airplane and how it made you feel?" Nathan took a deep breath and began recounting the events that had brought him to this moment, his 8-year-old perspective cutting through the complex legal and political analysis that had surrounded his case to reveal the fundamental human impact of discrimination on children who witnessed their parents being humiliated and brutalized for asserting their basic rights as paying customers and human beings. "The man wanted our airplane seats, and when my dad said no because we had tickets for those seats, the man called me bad names and said we didn't belong in the nice part of the airplane," Nathan said with the clarity that came from months of processing these events through dialogue and reflection. "Then the airplane captain called police officers who hurt my dad and dragged him away from me, and I was scared because I didn't understand why grown-ups were being so mean when we didn't do anything wrong." The chamber was absolutely silent as Nathan spoke his words carrying the moral authority of innocent suffering, while simultaneously demonstrating the resilience and wisdom that had enabled him to transform trauma into advocacy for systematic change, rather than simple punishment for those who had wronged him. Connor Blackwood, who had been allowed to return to the United States specifically to testify about his transformation and the impact of the restorative justice process, sat in the witness gallery with tears streaming down his face as he listened to Nathan's calm recounting of events that Connor's entitled tantrum had set in motion. Nathan, Representative Johnson asked gently, "What do you think should happen to make sure other children don't have to go through what you experienced?" Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper with notes he had prepared with his father's help, his 8-year-old handwriting listing the policy recommendations that had emerged from months of collaboration between victims, perpetrators, and institutional reformers working together toward healing rather than retribution. First, airplane workers should learn about not making guesses about people based on how they look. Nathan read carefully his suggestions, reflecting sophisticated understanding of implicit bias, training, and cultural competency education, despite being articulated through a child's vocabulary and perspective. Second, there should be special people whose job is to make sure kids feel safe and that families get treated fairly. Third, when someone makes a complaint about being treated badly, there should be independent people who investigate and make sure the truth gets told. Each recommendation had emerged from Nathan's direct experience of discrimination and his 8-year-old analysis of what had gone wrong and how it could be prevented, creating policy proposals that combined moral clarity with practical implementation strategies that industry experts had refined through the collaborative reform process. Representative Martinez, the ranking minority member, addressed Nathan with the solemnity that his presence and testimony demanded. "Nathan, you could have chosen to be angry and to demand that the people who hurt you be punished as severely as possible. Instead, you worked with them to create positive change. Why did you make that choice?" Nathan touched his silver locket unconsciously, channeling Charlotte's wisdom as he prepared to answer the question that went to the heart of his entire approach to healing and transformation rather than revenge and perpetual grievance. "My mom wrote me a letter before she died, and she said that when people hurt you, You can choose to hurt them back or to heal forward, Nathan said with the profound simplicity that had characterized all of his moral reasoning throughout this ordeal. Hurting them back might feel good for a little while, but healing forward makes the world better forever. I want the world to be better for other kids like me. The response created a moment of complete silence in the chamber as seasoned politicians and policy experts processed the 8-year-old's articulation of restorative justice principles and his demonstration that even severe trauma could be transformed into positive social change when guided by love rather than hatred. Chairman Rodriguez felt his voice catch with emotion as he prepared to close Nathan's testimony. Nathan, your wisdom and courage have inspired this committee and the entire nation. The legislation we are drafting, which will be known as the Nathan Thorne Aviation Dignity Act, will ensure that your experience leads to lasting protection for all passengers while honoring your choice to heal rather than simply punish. Nathan smiled with genuine happiness at hearing that positive change would emerge from his family's trauma, his expression showing the satisfaction that came from knowing that his suffering had been transformed into something meaningful that would help protect other children and families from experiencing similar harm. As Nathan concluded his testimony and was escorted from the chamber by his father and Judge Richardson, every person present understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented. A child who had used his own trauma to teach adults about moral courage, institutional accountability, and the possibility of genuine transformation, even among people and systems that had failed catastrophically in their basic responsibilities to treat all passengers with dignity and respect. The federal legislation that emerged from Nathan's testimony would indeed transform the aviation industry, creating enforceable standards for bias prevention, passenger advocacy, and civil rights protection that would reduce discrimination complaints by 89% within 3 years, while demonstrating that systematic change was possible when moral leadership transcended age, race, and traditional power structures. 6 months after Nathan's congressional testimony, the transformed AeroVantage Airlines headquarters in London bore little resemblance to the corporate fortress that had prioritized profit margins over human dignity, its executive floors now housing the world's first comprehensive Passenger Dignity Institute, where aviation employees from around the globe came to learn about unconscious bias, cultural competency, and the practical implementation of respect for all travelers, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived social status. The stark corporate artwork that had once adorned the walls had been replaced by photographs from the Institute's training programs, images of diverse airline employees learning to recognize and interrupt discrimination while providing exceptional service to passengers of all ages, races, and economic circumstances. The centerpiece of the main hallway was a large portrait of Charlotte Thorne with her quote about choosing love over anger donated by Nathan as a permanent reminder of the values that had guided the company's transformation. Nathan stood on a small platform in the Institute's main auditorium, wearing the honorary Chief Dignity Officer badge that Harrison Blackwood had created specifically for him, his 8-year-old presence commanding attention from an audience of seasoned aviation professionals who had come to understand that this child possessed insights about customer service and human relations that exceeded their own despite decades of industry experience. When grown-ups assume things about kids without asking questions, it makes kids feel invisible, Nathan said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium where flight attendants, gate agents, customer service representatives, and management personnel listened with the focused attention typically reserved for senior executives and industry experts. But when grown-ups see kids as real people with feelings and families who love them, then kids feel safe and happy, and their grown-ups feel happy too. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, recognizing the profound truth in Nathan's simple observation about the connection between treating children with respect and creating positive travel experiences for entire families, a principle that had become central to AeroVantage's new business model based on dignity rather than hierarchy. Monica Wells, who now served as the Institute's Director of Cultural Transformation, watched Nathan's presentation with pride and amazement at how far they had all traveled from the toxic dynamics that had characterized her former workplace, where customer service had been influenced more by prejudice and profit calculations than by basic human decency and professional standards. Nathan has taught us that excellent customer service isn't about treating some passengers better than others, Monica explained to a new class of trainees later that afternoon, her voice carrying the authority that came from personal experience with both discriminatory practices and transformative change. It's about recognizing every passenger as someone's precious family member who deserves to reach their destination safely, comfortably, and with their dignity intact. The training curricula that had emerged from the collaborative reform process represented a revolution in aviation education, replacing traditional approaches focused on risk management and operational efficiency with comprehensive programs that addressed implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and conflict resolution skills that enabled employees to handle difficult situations without resorting to discrimination or excessive force. Harrison Blackwood moved through the Institute with the energy and purpose that had once characterized his corporate empire building, but now was channeled toward creating positive change that honored Nathan's trauma, while preventing similar experiences for other families who deserved protection from prejudice and abuse of power. The most remarkable thing about Nathan's influence on our company, Harrison told a group of visiting airline executives who were considering implementing similar programs at their own organizations, is that he never demanded we change anything. He simply asked us to consider what kind of world we wanted to create for children like him, and that question made all of our previous practices impossible to justify or continue. Connor Blackwood's transformation had been equally dramatic. His former entitlement replaced by genuine humility as he worked with refugee resettlement organizations while serving his community service obligations, learning about real hardship and developing empathy for people whose struggles made his former complaints about airline seating seem petty and insignificant. Working with families who have lost everything has taught me what actual problems look like, Connor explained via video conference to one of the Institute's training sessions, his appearance serving as a cautionary tale about privilege unchecked by responsibility or moral education. Nathan showed me that hurting people doesn't make you important. It just makes you small, and helping people is what actually creates meaning and satisfaction in life. The financial results of AeroVantage's transformation had exceeded all projections, with customer satisfaction scores reaching historic highs across all demographic categories as passengers responded positively to treatment based on respect rather than assumptions about worthiness or ability to pay premium prices for basic human dignity. Employee satisfaction had improved even more dramatically as staff members found greater meaning and job satisfaction in work that aligned with their personal values rather than requiring them to implement policies that conflicted with their sense of right and wrong regarding how human beings should be treated. The Institute had become a model for other industries seeking to address discriminatory practices and create inclusive environments that served all customers effectively while maintaining profitability through excellence rather than exclusion. Dr. Williams continued to document the ongoing transformation for academic research that would influence restorative justice practices and corporate accountability measures across multiple sectors, her work demonstrating that even severe institutional failures could be addressed through collaborative processes that emphasized learning and growth rather than punishment and retribution. Nathan's presence at the Institute had become a monthly tradition, his visits providing both inspiration for employees who were learning new approaches to customer service and accountability for an organization that had committed to maintaining the standards that his trauma had helped create. Every time I see Nathan Harrison reflected during an interview with aviation industry publications, I'm reminded that children are watching how adults treat each other, and they're learning about justice, dignity, and respect from our actions rather than our words. We have a responsibility to model the kind of behavior that creates the world we want children to inherit. The Passenger Dignity Institute had processed over 10,000 aviation employees through its training programs, with graduates reporting significant improvements in their ability to recognize and interrupt discriminatory practices while providing excellent service to passengers of all backgrounds and circumstances. Nathan's influence had extended far beyond AeroVantage to inspire similar reforms across the aviation industry as federal regulations based on his congressional testimony created mandatory standards for bias prevention, passenger advocacy, and civil rights protection that were transforming travel experiences for millions of people annually. As Nathan concluded his presentation to another group of trainees, his 8-year-old wisdom continuing to guide adults toward better practices and more inclusive policies. The transformed auditorium erupted in applause for a child who had chosen healing over hatred and had thereby created positive change that would benefit countless families for generations to come. The David H. Koch Theater at Lincoln Center had been transformed into a celebration of redemption and social justice. Its elegant interior filled with an audience that represented the full spectrum of American society, from civil rights leaders and federal legislators to aviation executives and ordinary passengers who had been inspired by Nathan's story to examine their own responses to discrimination and injustice in their daily lives. Nathan sat in the front row between his father and Judge Richardson wearing his best suit and the quiet dignity that had characterized his approach throughout the 2-year journey from airplane victim to national symbol of healing and transformation. At 9 years old now, he had grown taller and more confident, but his essential character remained unchanged. Still the thoughtful child who asked profound questions and offered simple wisdom that cut through adult complexity to reveal fundamental truths about human nature and moral choice. The red carpet arrivals had attracted massive media attention, not for celebrity glamour, but for the unprecedented gathering of people who had chosen collaboration over conflict, education over retribution, and healing over hatred in response to viral injustice that could easily have destroyed lives and careers without creating any positive change or protection for future victims. Sophia Rivers, whose viral video had triggered the global response to Nathan's mistreatment, served as executive producer of the documentary that had required 2 years to film and edit as the story evolved from individual trauma to institutional transformation that exceeded anyone's initial expectations for what could be achieved through restorative justice and collaborative reform efforts. Tonight, we premiere Seat 1 A Child's Courage, Sophia announced from the stage, her voice carrying the same moral authority that had characterized her decision to record and share Nathan's airport ordeal despite potential legal and professional risks. This film documents not just discrimination and injustice, but the possibility of transformation and healing when people choose love over anger, even in the face of severe trauma and betrayal. The lights dimmed as the documentary began with footage from the original airplane incident. The brutal images of Nathan watching his father being dragged down the aisle, still shocking despite the passage of time, and the positive changes that had emerged from that moment of documented cruelty and abuse of power. But the film didn't stop with victimization and outrage, instead following Nathan's remarkable journey from trauma to advocacy, his 8-year-old decision to pursue healing rather than revenge, and the unprecedented collaboration between victims and perpetrators that had created systematic change, protecting millions of passengers from discriminatory treatment. The audience watched in fascination as Connor Blackwood's transformation unfolded on screen, his entitled arrogance gradually replaced by genuine humility, as months of community service with refugee families taught him about real hardship and the difference between manufactured grievances and actual suffering that demanded empathy and support rather than indifference or hostility. Harrison Blackwood's emotional breakdown and subsequent commitment to institutional reform provided the film's most powerful example of how accountability could lead to redemption when people were willing to examine their failures honestly and dedicate themselves to preventing similar harm in the future. Captain Calloway's recovery from alcoholism and his development of pilot training programs focused on recognizing and interrupting discrimination during flight operations, demonstrated that even professional failures could be transformed into educational resources that protected future passengers from similar trauma. Monica Wells's evolution from complicit employee to passionate advocate for passenger dignity showed how individual transformation could influence entire organizational cultures when supported by leadership commitment and comprehensive training that addressed unconscious bias and cultural competency. The documentary's centerpiece was Nathan's congressional testimony, his 8-year-old voice explaining restorative justice principles with clarity that had moved seasoned politicians to tears, while inspiring federal legislation that was already reducing discrimination complaints across the transportation industry. But the film's most profound moments came from Nathan's own reflection on his mother's teachings about choosing healing over hurting his ability to channel Charlotte's wisdom into practical guidance for adults who were struggling to respond constructively to injustice and trauma that could easily justify vengeful responses. My mom said that when people hurt you, you can choose to hurt them back or to heal forward. Nathan's voice narrated over images of the transformed AeroVantage headquarters and the Passenger Dignity Institute, where thousands of aviation employees had learned new approaches to customer service based on respect rather than assumptions. Healing forward is harder, but it makes the world better for everyone, including the people who hurt you. As the documentary concluded with footage of Nathan addressing another training session at the Institute, his 9-year-old wisdom continuing to guide adults toward more inclusive and dignified practices. The audience rose in sustained applause that reflected not just appreciation for the film, but recognition of the moral leadership that Nathan had provided throughout an ordeal that would have broken many adults. During the post-screening discussion, Nathan answered questions from the audience with the same thoughtful directness that had characterized his approach throughout the transformation process, his responses demonstrating continued growth in his understanding of complex social dynamics while maintaining the essential innocence and optimism that had made healing possible. Nathan asked a young teacher from the audience, "What advice would you give to other children who experience discrimination or unfair treatment from adults who are supposed to protect them?" Nathan considered the question seriously before responding with the wisdom that had guided his own journey from victim to advocate. Tell the truth about what happened. Ask for help from grown-ups who care about you, and remember that being treated badly doesn't mean you're worth less than other people. Some grown-ups make mistakes because they haven't learned how to see kids as real people yet, but that doesn't mean you should stop believing in yourself or give up on helping them learn better. The answer encapsulated Nathan's entire approach to dealing with injustice, maintaining personal dignity while seeking help from supportive adults, refusing to internalize negative messages from discriminatory treatment, and maintaining hope for positive change, even among people who had demonstrated harmful behavior. As the evening concluded with commitments from multiple organizations to implement similar training programs and restorative justice approaches in their own operations, Nathan looked around the theater filled with people who had been inspired by his story to examine their own responses to discrimination and consider how they might contribute to creating a more just and inclusive society. Judge Richardson leaned over to whisper in Nathan's ear, "Your mother would be so proud of how you've honored her memory by choosing to heal rather than hurt, and by helping so many other people learn about forgiveness and transformation." Nathan smiled with the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that his trauma had been transformed into something meaningful that would continue protecting other children and families long after his own story had faded from public attention. A legacy that honored Charlotte's teachings about finding purpose in pain and hope in the midst of human failure, 2 years after the incident that had changed everything. Nathan Thorne walked down the jet bridge at JFK International Airport holding his father's hand, both of them approaching the same Boeing 777 aircraft that had been the scene of their traumatic encounter with discrimination and violence, though everything about their current experience reflected the transformation that Nathan's wisdom and courage had inspired throughout the aviation industry. At 10 years old now, Nathan had grown taller and more confident, but he still carried the same thoughtful demeanor that had enabled him to respond to trauma with grace rather than bitterness. his character shaped by Charlotte's posthumous guidance and his own remarkable capacity for forgiveness and moral leadership that continued to inspire adults who worked with him. The Aero Vantage flight crew greeted them with genuine warmth that reflected comprehensive training in passenger dignity and cultural competency. Their professionalism enhanced by understanding of implicit bias and commitment to treating every traveler with respect, regardless of appearance, background, or assumptions about social status or financial circumstances. Monica Wells, now wearing the insignia of Chief Passenger Advocate, personally welcomed Nathan and Elijah aboard the aircraft with a smile that carried authentic joy at seeing the child whose trauma had catalyzed her own transformation from complicit employee to passionate advocate for inclusive customer service and organizational accountability. "Nathan, it's wonderful to see you again," Monica said warmly, her voice free of the nervous deference that had once characterized her interactions with passengers she perceived as potentially problematic. "Your usual seats are ready, and I want you to know that this crew has completed the advanced dignity training program that you helped design." Nathan smiled with the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that his experience had been transformed into practical protection for other passengers who deserved to travel safely and comfortably, without facing discrimination or harassment based on prejudices and assumptions that had no legitimate place in professional customer service. "Thank you, Ms. Monica," Nathan replied politely, using the manners that Charlotte had taught him for acknowledging service workers who took pride in their professionalism and commitment to treating all passengers fairly. "I'm excited to see how much better everything has become since we started working together." As they settled into seats 1A and 1B, the same seats that Connor Blackwood had demanded 2 years earlier, Nathan pulled out his current origami project, a complex dragon that represented his growing artistic skills and his continued use of paper folding as a method for processing complex emotions and maintaining focus during challenging situations. Captain Elizabeth Morrison's voice came over the intercom with the standard safety announcements, but her tone carried additional warmth as she addressed the passengers who had inadvertently become catalysts for industry-wide reform that had improved working conditions for employees while enhancing travel experiences for millions of passengers annually. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison welcoming you aboard Flight 882 to London Heathrow. We're honored to have with us today Nathan Thorne, whose courage and wisdom have helped make aviation safer and more welcoming for passengers of all backgrounds." "Nathan, thank you for teaching us that dignity isn't an upgrade. It's standard equipment on every flight." The announcement prompted spontaneous applause from passengers throughout the aircraft, their recognition of Nathan's contribution reflecting broader social awareness that had emerged from his story about the possibility of transformation and healing, even in response to severe injustice and institutional failure. Nathan waved politely to acknowledge the appreciation, while maintaining the humble demeanor that had characterized his approach throughout his journey from victim to advocate, his response demonstrating continued growth in his ability to handle public attention, while staying focused on the values and principles that guided his actions. During the flight, Connor Blackwood approached their seats wearing the uniform of AeroVantage's new Passenger Dignity Corps. His former entitlement completely replaced by genuine humility as he carried out his community service obligations by assisting travelers who needed extra attention or support during their journeys. "Nathan, Mr. Thorne," Connor said respectfully, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized his behavior during their previous encounter. "I wanted to thank you again for choosing to help me learn rather than just punishing me for my terrible behavior. Working with refugee families and homeless children has taught me what real problems look like, and I'm grateful every day that you gave me the chance to become a better person." Nathan looked up at Connor with the same forgiveness he had shown throughout their collaborative transformation process, his capacity for grace, continuing to amaze adults who witnessed his ability to see potential for positive change, even among people who had caused him significant harm. "You're welcome, Mr. Connor," Nathan said simply, his words carrying the profound acceptance that had enabled healing and growth for everyone involved in their story. My mom always said that mistakes are only bad if we don't learn from them, and you learned really important things that help you take care of other people now. The interaction represented everything that Nathan's approach to justice had achieved. Not the destruction of people who had wronged him, but their transformation into advocates for the values and principles that prevented future harm while creating positive change that extended far beyond individual accountability to influence entire systems and cultures. As Flight 882 crossed the Atlantic Ocean carrying passengers who traveled in dignity and safety because of reforms that Nathan's trauma had inspired, Elijah reflected on the journey that had transformed his son's suffering into systematic protection for countless other families, who would never know how a 10-year-old boy's wisdom had made their travel experiences more humane and respectful. Nathan worked quietly on his origami dragon while the airplane carried them toward London, his small hands creating beauty and complexity from simple materials, in the same way that his response to discrimination had created positive change from painful circumstances through the application of values that Charlotte had taught him about forgiveness, education, and hope. The silver locket around Nathan's neck caught the cabin lighting as he leaned against his father's shoulder. Charlotte's letter about choosing love over anger having guided them through the most difficult period of their lives while inspiring transformation that honored her memory and her belief in human capacity for growth and redemption even in the face of severe failure and moral blindness. "Dad," Nathan said quietly as the aircraft began its descent toward Heathrow Airport. "I think Mom would be happy about how everything turned out. We didn't just make things better for us. We made things better for everyone." Elijah felt tears sting his eyes as he recognized Charlotte speaking through their son. Her wisdom and values, living on through Nathan's choices, and their ripple effects throughout an industry that now treated passengers with the dignity that every human being deserved, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived social status. "Yes," son Elijah replied softly, pulling Nathan closer and feeling Charlotte's presence as strongly as if she were sitting beside them watching their family's trauma transformed into blessing for countless others. "She would be very proud of the man you're becoming and the world you're helping create through your courage and kindness." As the Boeing 777 touched down on British soil, completing a journey that had begun with discrimination and violence, but had evolved into healing and transformation that exceeded anyone's expectations for what could be achieved through restorative justice and collaborative reform. Nathan closed his eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to his mother for teaching him that love really could overcome hatred when people were brave enough to choose the harder path of forgiveness and education rather than the easier road of revenge and perpetual grievance. Nathan's foundation now operates in 47 countries, training transportation workers in dignity principles that have reduced discrimination complaints by 89% across participating airlines while improving customer satisfaction ratings to historic levels. Connor leads the European division with genuine dedication. Harrison mentors young executives in ethical leadership, and Monica directs the flight crew certification program that has become the international standard for inclusive customer service. The documentary won 3 Emmy Awards and inspired similar programs in healthcare education and hospitality industries where Nathan's story continues to influence policies that protect vulnerable populations from discriminatory treatment. His congressional testimony remains required viewing in business schools across America, teaching future leaders about moral courage and the possibility of transformation even among institutions that have failed catastrophically in their basic responsibilities to treat all people with dignity. Every AeroVantage aircraft now carries a placard with Charlotte Thorne's final letter. "When the world shows you its worst, choose to show it your best. Pain shared becomes healing. Love multiplied becomes justice." Nathan still flies Seat 1. A. When traveling now, teaching other children that dignity isn't about where you sit, but how you treat the person sitting next to you, his mother's wisdom continuing to create positive change through every choice he makes to heal rather than hurt. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more accounts of courage and transformation. Share your thoughts about how conversations across difference have changed your own perspective. Together we can build bridges of understanding one story at a time.